History has a way of focusing our attention on the grand figures, the famous kings and legendary emperors whose names echo through the centuries. We are taught that these titans shaped the world through their wills, their wars, and their wisdom. But what if that is only part of the story? What if the true levers of change were pulled not in royal courts, but in the quiet corridors of a minor noble's castle, or on a lonely road where a single, unexpected event could alter everything? Imagine a world where the fate of empires hinged not on the great kings you know from history books, but on the sudden, unexpected death of a minor count or a forgotten duke. This is the hidden reality of the medieval world, a place where power was terrifyingly personal and stability was a fragile illusion. For every famous ruler who left a mark, there were dozens of lesser-known leaders whose passing created a vacuum that sucked entire regions into chaos, realigning alliances and redrawing borders in ways that would last for generations. In this video, we will pull back the curtain on these hidden turning points. We are about to explore 25 pivotal moments where the demise of a lesser-known leader sent shockwaves through the political landscape, triggering rapid and dramatic power shifts that reshaped continents. This is not just a list of obscure facts. It is a journey into the heart of how history actually works. We will travel from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked plains of Iberia, from the bustling ports of the Mediterranean to the frozen forests of the Baltic. Along the way, we will uncover stories of raw ambition, heartbreaking betrayal, and the profound fragility of power itself. These are the narratives that rarely make the main chapters of history books, yet they hold the keys to understanding why certain dynasties rose while others fell into dust, and why the map of Europe looks the way it does today. By understanding these overlooked catalysts, we gain a deeper, more nuanced appreciation for how history truly unfolds. It is not just a parade of famous actions and deliberate decisions. Often, it is a story of silent exits, of chance accidents, and of the unintended consequences that ripple out from the death of a single individual. Prepare to discover how the passing of a childless lord or the assassination of a regional duke could topple thrones, ignite decades of war, and quietly set the stage for the world we know now. This exploration is an invitation to see the past not as a predetermined path, but as a web of interconnected moments, each one holding a potential that was only unlocked by a sudden and often forgotten departure. To truly grasp the immense consequences of these sudden deaths, we need to step back and understand the political landscape they occurred in. Think of medieval power not as a solid, stable structure, but as a precarious tower of blocks, where the stability of the entire edifice depended on the strength of each individual piece. The most critical block, the one holding up so much else, was the system of inheritance. And in the centuries we are exploring, this system was far from the neat and tidy rule of primogeniture where the firstborn son inherits everything that would become more common later on. Instead, succession was a tangled web of customs, oral traditions, and competing interpretations. A lord's authority was a personal bond, a complex network of promises and loyalties sworn directly to him. When he died, that bond was severed and everything was up for grabs. The question of who would step into his shoes was not always answered by a simple will or a law. It was often answered by the sword. This created a world where the death of any ruler, from a king down to a local baron, was a moment of extreme danger and opportunity. A realm could be plunged into chaos overnight, not because of a foreign invasion, but simply because the man at the top had taken his last breath. This was the domino effect in its purest form. One death could topple an entire political order. The potential for disaster was highest when a leader died without a clear and capable heir. The absence of an adult son was like a flashing beacon to every ambitious neighbor and restless relative. A child heir was a massive liability. A regency council, often riven by internal squabbles, would rule in their name, projecting weakness instead of strength. And a daughter, while she could carry a claim to the land, she could not always command the loyalty of warriors in a society built on martial prowess. Her inheritance became a prize to be won by the nobleman she married, turning a peaceful succession into a high-stakes tournament for her hand, with the domain itself as the ultimate reward. This is why so many of the stories we will explore feature these exact scenarios. The death of a childless count did not just mean a period of mourning. It meant that his lands were suddenly ownerless, at least in the eyes of those with the army to back up their claim. Powerful figures like kings or dukes, who were nominally the superiors of these lesser lords, often saw such moments not as a tragedy to be managed, but as a golden opportunity to expand their own territories and crush potential rivals. This volatile environment was fueled by the very nature of feudal relationships. A king's power was not absolute over his entire kingdom. He relied on a pyramid of nobles, dukes, counts, and barons who governed their own patches of land. In return for their lands, they owed him military service and loyalty, but that loyalty was a two-way street. A strong, respected king could command obedience. A weak king, or a moment of uncertainty during a succession, gave these powerful vassals a chance to renegotiate the terms of their allegiance, or even to strike out on their own. When a duke died, his knights and lower-level lords would be watching closely. If his heir seemed weak, they might transfer their allegiance to a different, stronger candidate, perhaps a neighboring duke or even a foreign king who promised them more land or greater autonomy. This is how a local crisis could rapidly escalate into a regional war, drawing in multiple factions. The death of a single leader could crack the foundation of a whole network of alliances, causing it to crumble and reform in a completely new and unpredictable shape. Understanding this framework of fragile loyalties and opportunistic power grabs is the master key that unlocks the significance of every story we are about to tell. It reveals a world where history was not just shaped by the great deeds of famous monarchs, but by the silent, unexpected exits of the seemingly insignificant, whose passing created a vacuum that destiny was all too eager to fill. To see this principle in action on a grand scale, let us turn to one of the most dramatic examples from 12th century England. The stage was set by King Henry I, a formidable ruler who had painstakingly consolidated his power after the Norman conquest. He had one crucial asset for securing the future of his dynasty: a legitimate son and heir, William Adelin. The young prince was not just a successor, he was the living embodiment of the realm's stability, recognized by all the powerful barons as the next king. Then, on a cold November night in 1120, everything shattered. The White Ship, a fast new vessel carrying Prince William and a glittering party of young nobles back from Normandy, struck a rock in the English Channel and sank. There were almost no survivors. The heir to the throne was dead. The immediate aftermath was a political earthquake. King Henry was left without a clear male heir. He had other children, including a daughter named Matilda, but the idea of a woman ruling England in her own right was alien and deeply unsettling to the Norman aristocracy. In desperation, Henry forced his barons to swear an oath to accept Matilda as his successor. But oaths sworn under duress are easily broken once the king who demanded them is gone. When Henry himself died in 1135, the door was flung wide open for a challenger. Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, who happened to have narrowly avoided sailing on the fateful White Ship himself. Stephen rushed to England and, with the support of barons who feared a queen, seized the crown. What followed was nearly 2 decades of brutal civil war, a period so devastating it became known simply as the Anarchy. Chroniclers of the time wrote that Christ and his saints slept as armed bands loyal to Stephen and Matilda ravaged the countryside, building illegal castles and plunging the ordinary people into a nightmare of violence and lawlessness. This catastrophic conflict, sparked by a single maritime disaster, is our macro-scale preview. It demonstrates with terrifying clarity how the entire stability of a kingdom could be balanced on the life of one individual. William Adelin was not a minor figure, but the mechanism his death triggered is identical to the ones we will see in our lesser-known cases. The sudden vacuum of power, the rushed and contested succession, the eruption of long-simmering rivalries, and the descent into chaos, these are the universal ingredients. The Anarchy shows us the system at its breaking point. It proves that the fragility of hereditary power was not a minor flaw but a fundamental feature of medieval politics. For every famous crisis like this one, there were dozens of smaller, regional versions playing out across Europe, where the death of a count or a duke created a micro-anarchy within their own domain. The stakes for the wider world might have been smaller, but for the people living in those counties and duchies, the consequences of their lord's sudden death, the sieges, the famines, the shifting allegiances were every bit as profound and life-altering. The story of the White Ship is the classic template, the proof of concept for the hidden historical forces we are about to explore. So we begin our journey into these hidden turning points not in a famous royal capital, but in the rugged, politically fractured landscape of 11th century Catalonia. Here, on the northeastern edge of the Iberian Peninsula, the Christian county of Barcelona was a beacon of resistance, one of several small states leading the slow and arduous Reconquista against the Muslim Taifa kingdoms to the south. But in the year 1082, this forward momentum was violently interrupted by an event that seemed, on the surface, like a local family tragedy. The ruling Count, Ramon Berenguer II, was ambushed and murdered while traveling through a forest. He was co-ruler of the county, sharing power in an unusual and clearly tense arrangement with his identical twin brother, Berenguer Ramon II. The circumstances of the attack were shrouded in mystery from the start, but public suspicion fell instantly and heavily upon the surviving brother. How could it not? The beneficiary of the crime was now the sole ruler, and the bitter rivalry between the twins was an open secret. Berenguer Ramon II was immediately branded with a dark nickname that would follow him into history, the Fratricide. This accusation, whether true or not, created a poison at the very heart of Barcelona's government. A ruler suspected of murdering his own kin to seize power could never command the full, unquestioning loyalty of his knights and nobles. Trust evaporated. The county, which needed unity more than ever to face external threats, was instead consumed by internal strife and factionalism. The Count's authority was undermined at every turn, as those loyal to the murdered Ramon Berenguer II agitated for justice, and those who simply sought power saw an opportunity in the ruler's weakness. This internal paralysis came at a critical moment. The struggle against the Taifa kingdoms was a delicate balance of military campaigns and shrewd diplomacy, requiring a strong, decisive hand. With Barcelona's leadership crippled by scandal, its ability to project power and influence waned, potentially handing an advantage to its Muslim rivals. The stain of fratricide became so politically toxic that it eventually forced Berenguer Ramon's hand. To cleanse his name and perhaps his soul, he embarked on a penitential crusade to Jerusalem, a common act of contrition for medieval nobles burdened by grave sin. He joined the forces of the First Crusade, but he never returned from the Holy Land, dying in obscurity far from the county he had gained under such a dark cloud. His departure and death solved the immediate crisis of legitimacy by simply removing the problem. With both twins gone, the path was cleared for their young nephew, Ramon Berengar III, to inherit a county that was now consolidated under a single, unquestioned ruler, and more importantly, free from the shadow of his uncle's alleged crime. This young man would go on to become one of Catalonia's greatest medieval rulers, expanding its territory through marriage and conquest, and laying the foundation for the maritime empire of the Crown of Aragon. The tragic death in the forest, a sudden power shift born of violence and suspicion, ultimately set the stage for a new era of strength, proving that even the darkest political crimes could, through the strange alchemy of history, give rise to a lasting and powerful legacy. From the sun-drenched intrigue of Catalonia, we now travel north and east into the heart of Central Europe, where a different kind of power shift was unfolding, one that demonstrates the fleeting nature of royal favor. Here, in the rugged lands of Bohemia, Duke Bretislaus II had achieved something extraordinary. For his steadfast loyalty and military support to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, particularly during the grueling investiture controversy, Bretislaus was rewarded with a title no Bohemian ruler had ever held before: King. This was not an empty honor. It elevated him, and by extension his duchy, above the other regional princes of the empire. For a time, Bohemia stood as a kingdom, its duke wearing a crown. But this new status came with a critical and ultimately fatal limitation. The royal title was a personal gift bestowed upon Bretislaus alone. It was not declared to be hereditary. It was as if the emperor had lent him a magnificent cloak of royalty, one that was meant to be returned upon his death. And when Bretislaus passed away in 1092, that is exactly what happened. The cloak was taken back, the Kingdom of Bohemia instantly reverted to being a mere duchy, and the political landscape was reset to a state of dangerous uncertainty. The immediate consequence was a power vacuum of the most destructive kind. Bretislaus had several sons, and the Bretislaus dynasty was filled with ambitious cousins and uncles, all of whom saw the ducal throne as their rightful inheritance. The problem was, there were no clear, universally accepted rules for who should inherit. The principle of seniority, where the oldest male relative might take charge, competed with the growing idea of direct lineal descent from father to eldest son. This ambiguity was a recipe for disaster. What followed was not a peaceful transition but a brutal, multi-sided civil war. Brother turned against brother, cousin against cousin, in a bloody struggle for control that would span decades. The unity that Bretislaus had carefully built through his reign shattered overnight. The very armies that should have been defending Bohemia's borders were instead turned inward, fighting each other across the countryside, draining the treasury and devastating the land. This internal fratricide made the duchy a house divided against itself, incapable of presenting a strong, unified front to the outside world. This self-inflicted weakness had profound external consequences. Just a generation earlier, a strong Bohemia under Bretislaus had been a crucial ally to the Holy Roman Emperor, a power that could influence imperial politics. Now consumed by internal conflict, it became a pawn. The emperor, once an ally, now saw a perfect opportunity to reassert his direct authority over the fractious duchy. The warring Bretislaus factions, desperate for support, would each appeal to the emperor, effectively inviting him to act as the ultimate arbiter of their dispute. This gave the imperial court immense leverage. By playing the rivals against one another, the emperor could ensure that whichever candidate eventually emerged victorious would be deeply indebted to him, and thus far more pliable. The death of Bretislaus, therefore, did not just trigger a family feud, it triggered a dramatic reduction in Bohemian autonomy. The dream of an independent kingdom died with the king who held the title, and the reality that followed was one of subservience and internal chaos. It's a stark lesson in the difference between personal prestige and institutional power. A title granted to a man rather than to a nation is a fragile thing indeed, a flame that can be snuffed out in an instant, leaving behind only the cold darkness of conflict. Now let us turn our attention to the windswept and rebellious north of England, a land that proved to be one of the most difficult regions for William the Conqueror to tame. In the years immediately following the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Norman grip on power was still tenuous, especially north of the River Humber. This was the domain of powerful Anglo-Saxon earls, men whose families had ruled vast territories for generations, and among the most significant of these figures was Gospatric. Appointed Earl of Northumbria by William himself in 1067, Gospatric's story is a fascinating study in survival and shifting allegiances in a world turned upside down. He was not a blindly loyal subject, but a pragmatic nobleman walking a political tightrope, forced to swear fealty to the foreign conqueror while undoubtedly feeling the pull of his own people and their desire for independence. His position was incredibly precarious, a constant balancing act between the demands of a new, ruthless king and the expectations of a proud and restive population that viewed the Normans as oppressive invaders. Gospatric's loyalty was tested almost immediately. In the year 1069, a major rebellion erupted in the north, supported by a Danish invasion fleet. The uprising culminated in the brutal massacre of the Norman garrison at Durham. While the historical records are not entirely clear on Gospatric's precise role, he was almost certainly involved with, or at least sympathetic to, the rebel cause. This was enough for William the Conqueror, a man who tolerated no ambiguity when it came to defiance. The conqueror's response was swift and horrific, the harrying of the north. In a systematic campaign of destruction during the winter of 1069 and 1070, William's armies laid waste to the countryside from York to Durham, burning villages, destroying crops, and slaughtering the population. It was a calculated act of terror designed to crush the spirit of resistance once and for all. In the aftermath of this devastation, Gospatric, like many other English nobles, was stripped of his title and forced to flee for his life, finding temporary refuge in Scotland. But Gospatric's story was not over. In a remarkable twist, he was later restored to a position of authority, though not his old earldom, as part of William's complex strategy to govern the north through a mix of Norman military might and reconciled English leadership. This second chance, however, only highlights the persistent challenge Gospatric represented. He was a symbol of the old order, a living link to the pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. His very presence, even as a supposedly loyal earl, was a reminder of a different England. His death sometime between 1072 and 1075, whether in a minor skirmish or from natural causes, was therefore a moment of immense significance for King William. It removed the last major Anglo-Saxon figurehead in the north, a man who had proven he could be a focal point for rebellion. With Gospatric gone, the final obstacle to the complete Normanization of the English aristocracy was cleared. William the Conqueror wasted no time in exploiting this new reality. The lands and titles once held by Gospatric and other departed Anglo-Saxon earls were now free to be distributed as rewards to William's most trusted Norman, Breton, and Flemish followers. This systematic redistribution of land was the final nail in the coffin of the old elite. Where once Anglo-Saxon thegns had governed their ancestral estates, now Norman barons built formidable stone castles to dominate the landscape. The cultural and political transformation of England, which had begun on the field at Hastings, was accelerated and finalized by the quiet departure of men like Gospatric. His death did not trigger a dramatic civil war like some of our other examples, but its consequence was perhaps even more profound. It allowed for a silent, administrative revolution that replaced an entire ruling class, cementing the Norman hold on England and altering the language, laws, and landscape of the nation for centuries to come. It is a powerful testament to how the elimination of a single, pivotal figure can allow a conqueror to complete his work, turning a military victory into a permanent political and cultural legacy. Our journey now takes us to the sun-drenched eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea, to the Kingdom of Croatia, where the death of a single king would lead not merely to a change in leadership, but to the quiet extinguishing of a nation's independence for hundreds of years. King Demetrius Zvonimir's reign marked a golden age for the Croatian medieval state. Crowned with the blessing of Pope Gregory VII himself, Zvonimir's rule was characterized by a strong alliance with the papacy, fostering religious and political ties that positioned Croatia as a respected Latin Christian kingdom in the volatile Balkans. His court was a center of culture, and his authority seemed unshakable, a beacon of stability and prosperity. But this golden age was built on a foundation that was far more fragile than anyone could have anticipated. The entire structure of this independent kingdom rested on the life and lineage of one man, and in the year 1089, that foundation crumbled in an instant with Zvonimir's sudden and unexpected death. The crisis was immediate and total. The king died without a clear, adult male heir to succeed him. In the political world of the 11th century, this was the worst-case scenario for any realm. A childless king was a king who left behind a vacuum, and nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. The question of succession was thrown wide open, and various factions within the Croatian nobility began to maneuver, each backing a different candidate, each seeing an opportunity to advance their own family's power. Into this brewing storm stepped Zvonimir's widow, Queen Helena. She was no passive observer. She was a Hungarian princess, the sister of the powerful King Ladislaus I of Hungary. Seeing her husband's kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war, and with her own position as Queen Dowager suddenly precarious, she made a fateful decision. She invoked her family connections and called upon her brother to intervene, to bring order to the chaos and, not coincidentally, to protect her own interests. This invitation was the opening the Hungarian crown had been waiting for. What began as a proposed intervention to support a sister's claim quickly escalated into a full-blown campaign of conquest. Hungarian armies crossed the border, not merely as peacekeepers but as claimants to the throne itself. The fragmented Croatian nobility, divided among themselves and unable to unite behind a single native candidate, found it impossible to mount a coordinated defense against the organized might of the Hungarian kingdom. A period of instability and conflict followed, a confused and bloody struggle where the future of Croatia was the prize. The resistance was brave but ultimately disorganized, and it was gradually worn down over the next decade. The final act came in the year 1102, when the Hungarian King Koloman was crowned King of Croatia in a ceremony that formalized the Pacta Conventa, a personal union between the two kingdoms. With that ceremony, the independent Kingdom of Croatia, which had flourished under Zvonimir, ceased to exist as a sovereign state. It was now joined in a union with the Kingdom of Hungary, a relationship where Croatia retained some degree of internal autonomy, but its foreign policy, its military, and its ultimate sovereignty were directed from the Hungarian capital. For centuries to come, Croatian kings would be, first and foremost, kings of Hungary. The death of Demetrius Zvonimir, therefore, was not just another succession crisis. It was a geopolitical extinction event. It demonstrates with heartbreaking clarity how the biological accident of a childless king could erase a nation from the map of independent powers. A kingdom that had built its own churches, minted its own coins, and forged its own alliances was, in the span of just a few years, absorbed into a larger neighbor, its destiny forever altered by the sudden, silent departure of its last great native ruler. While the stories of kings and dukes often dominate the historical record, our next shift reveals a different kind of power, one wielded not from a throne but from a position of fierce maternal and political defense. In the strategically vital Low Countries, a region perpetually contested by emerging principalities, the county of Hainaut found its fate resting in the hands of a remarkably tenacious woman, Countess Richilde. Following the death of her husband, Count Herman of Hainaut, Richilde was not content to fade into the background as a mere regent for her young sons. Instead, she stepped directly into the fray, becoming the undisputed leader and protector of her family's inheritance. Her reign was defined by a single, overwhelming threat: the relentless expansionism of her powerful neighbor, Baldwin VI, the Count of Flanders, and after his death, his even more ambitious successor, Baldwin V. These Flemish counts viewed the neighboring Hainaut not as an equal partner, but as a prize to be absorbed, and they repeatedly tested its defenses. Richilde met this aggression head-on, rallying her knights, forging alliances, and personally leading the resistance to protect her son's birthright. She was a constant, formidable obstacle to Flemish ambitions, a ruler who understood that her family's survival depended on her unwavering resolve. The Countess's struggle culminated in a moment of catastrophic defeat that only underscored her importance. In the year 1071, she found a powerful ally in King Philip I of France, who also feared the growing strength of Flanders. Together, they confronted the army of Baldwin V of Flanders at the Battle of Cassel. The result was a disaster for Richilde and her French ally. Her forces were routed, and in the chaotic aftermath of the fight, the Countess herself was captured on the battlefield, becoming a prisoner of the very man who sought to dispossess her children. This should have been the end of the story. The capture of the ruling Countess would typically signal the immediate annexation of her lands. Yet, even in this moment of absolute defeat, Richilde's political acumen shone through. She managed to negotiate her release, though the terms were harsh, likely involving significant territorial concessions. Her survival and return to power, even in a weakened state, demonstrated her incredible resilience. For another 15 years, she continued to govern and defend the rump of her county, a living bulwark against complete Flemish domination. Her presence alone maintained a fragile status quo. This long-running defense of Hainaut's autonomy makes the significance of her death in 1086 so profound. When Countess Richilde finally passed away, the primary force that had contained Flemish ambition for 2 decades was suddenly gone. The power dynamic shifted overnight. Her sons, while now adults, lacked their mother's iron will, her decades of experience, and perhaps the sheer force of personality that had commanded the loyalty of their vassals. The psychological barrier that Richilde had represented for Baldwin V of Flanders simply vanished. The power struggle that ensued within Hainaut, likely fueled by uncertainty and competing factions among the nobility, created the perfect opportunity for the Flemish count to strike. With the formidable matriarch no longer there to organize resistance, Baldwin moved decisively to seize control of long-coveted territories, significantly altering the map of the Low Countries. The county of Hainaut was diminished, its autonomy severely curtailed, and the balance of power tipped decisively in favor of a much-strengthened Flanders. Richilde's story is a powerful corrective to the simplistic notion of medieval women as passive political pawns, traded in marriage to seal alliances. She was unequivocally an active political and military leader in her own right. Her life reminds us that while inheritance laws often favored men, the realities of power on the ground were more complex. A determined widow could become the linchpin of a dynasty's survival, holding territory against formidable odds through a combination of diplomacy, warfare, and sheer force of will. Her death, therefore, was not just the passing of a ruler, it was the removal of a dynasty's chief defender. It exposes the vulnerability that lay beneath the surface of even the most determined regencies, showing how the fate of an entire county could be inextricably linked to the lifespan of one resilient woman. The sudden power shift that followed her departure underscores that in the medieval world, the loss of a skilled leader was a catastrophe, regardless of their gender, and the protection they offered died with them. The fate of Prince Álmos of Hungary presents one of the most chilling examples of how medieval rulers would go to unimaginable lengths to secure their power, revealing a brutal logic where physical mutilation was seen as a political solution. The conflict between King Colman, known as the Bookish for his scholarly interests, and his younger brother Álmos was not a sudden quarrel but a deep-seated dynastic struggle that festered for decades. As the younger brother, Álmos represented a permanent alternative, a figure around whom every disgruntled noble or ambitious faction could rally. His very existence was a threat to Colman's reign, a living challenge to the king's authority that no amount of battlefield victory or diplomatic agreement could permanently erase. This was the fundamental problem of brotherly rivalry in a hereditary monarchy. As long as Álmos could see the crown, he would reach for it, and as long as others could see him as a path to power, they would support his claims. The cycle of rebellion, pardon, and then rebellion again became a wearying pattern that Colman, after years of patience, finally decided to break in the most definitive way possible. The king's chosen method was as effective as it was horrifying. By having his brother and his young nephew, Bela, blinded, Colman was invoking a grim but established practice in the Byzantine Empire, a sphere of influence that Hungary was increasingly connected to. The act was not merely about punishment or cruelty, though it was undoubtedly both. It was a calculated act of political neutering. According to the customs and perceptions of the time, a physical disability, especially one as severe as blindness, was seen as rendering a man unfit to rule. A king was expected to be a warrior, to lead his armies into battle, to be God's chosen vessel of strength and authority. A blind man could not do this. By mutilating Álmos and his son, Colman was not just inflicting a terrible wound, he was publicly and permanently disqualifying them from the kingship, removing their political legitimacy in the eyes of the nobility and the church. It was a way to eliminate the threat they posed without the spiritual stain of committing fratricide and infanticide, a dark compromise between murder and mercy. The death of Álmos shortly after this brutal act, likely from infection stemming from the crude procedure, brought a grim and immediate form of closure. With the primary rival dead and his heir physically and symbolically broken, Colman had achieved his short-term goal. The most dangerous branch of the Arpad dynasty had been effectively pruned away, and the path seemed clear for Colman's own son, Stephen, to inherit a stable and unchallenged throne. For a time, it appeared that this ruthless strategy had worked. The kingdom entered a period of relative quiet, the constant whispers of conspiracy and the drumbeats of rebellion falling silent. Colman had enforced a brutal peace, demonstrating a terrifying new threshold of what a Hungarian king was willing to do to his own blood to preserve his power. This established a precedent that would hang over the court for generations, a warning that the stakes of dynastic rivalry were now literally a matter of life, death, and physical integrity. However, this enforced stability came at a terrible long-term cost. The violence inflicted upon Álmos and Bela did not erase their line. It simply drove the bitterness and desire for vengeance underground where it festered. The act created a legacy of hatred and a powerful narrative of martyrdom that future generations would exploit. While the blinded Bela was initially sidelined, his very existence remained a poignant symbol of royal injustice. The memory of the cruel uncle who had maimed his own kin became a powerful weapon for Colomon's enemies. Years later, after Colomon and his son had both died, that suppressed branch of the family would indeed resurface. The very son who had been blinded, Bela, would eventually, and against all odds, be called upon to take the throne during a crisis, his disability seemingly overlooked in the face of his strong lineage and the need for experienced leadership. The brutal act meant to secure one king's line ultimately could not prevent the eventual triumph of the line he had tried to destroy. The sudden end of Prince Álmos, therefore, is a stark lesson in the limitations of terror as a tool of governance. It shows that while a single death could be used to enforce a temporary and brutal stability, it could also plant the seeds of future conflict, creating a debt of violence that history would inevitably demand be repaid. The story of Duke Bretislaus II is a tragic lesson in the perils of reform, a case where a ruler's bold attempt to impose order instead unleashed the very disorder he feared. For decades, the Przemyslid dynasty of Bohemia had been trapped in a vicious cycle of internal warfare, a brutal merry-go-round of power where uncles, brothers, and cousins constantly vied for the ducal throne. The root of this instability was a murky and contested system of inheritance known as lateral succession, or seniority. In this model, the duchy did not automatically pass from a father to his eldest son. Instead, it was meant to circulate among the senior male members of the entire extended family, from an older brother to a younger brother, and then perhaps to a cousin before eventually, maybe, circling back to the sons of the original ruler. In theory, this was meant to ensure that an experienced, mature leader always held power. In practice, it was a recipe for perpetual conflict, as every death of a duke triggered a frantic scramble among all potential male heirs, each with their own powerful supporters and private armies. The result was a duchy perpetually at war with itself, its strength sapped by fratricidal strife just when it needed unity to face external threats. Bretislaus II, having witnessed this destructive pattern his entire life, decided to break it. He was determined to replace the chaotic lateral system with a clear, predictable rule of primogeniture, the direct inheritance from father to eldest son. This was not merely an administrative change, it was a revolutionary act that threatened to upend the entire power structure of the Bohemian nobility. By insisting that his own son should succeed him, Bretislaus was effectively disinheriting his own brothers, his cousins, and all the other Przemyslid princes who had grown up expecting their turn at the throne. More than that, he was challenging the interests of the powerful noble families who had built their wealth and influence by backing different candidates in each succession dispute. These nobles, the Wierzchowscy and others, had learned to thrive in the chaos, playing rivals against one another to extract concessions, lands, and privileges. A stable, hereditary succession would empower the duke at their expense, centralizing authority in Prague and making the nobility more subservient to a single, continuous ruling line. Bretislaus's reform, therefore, was not just a family matter. It was a direct assault on the political and economic interests of the most powerful men in the land. The Duke's ambitious plan immediately created a firestorm of opposition. The Premyslid princes who saw their future claims extinguished were naturally furious, viewing the move as a tyrannical betrayal of ancient custom. But the real danger came from the aggrieved aristocracy, who saw their path to influence and riches being systematically closed off. The atmosphere at court grew thick with conspiracy and resentment. Bretislaus, confident in his authority or perhaps blinded by his conviction that his reform was for the good of the duchy, may have underestimated the depth of the hatred he had provoked. He was attempting to force a modern, centralized concept of power onto a deeply traditional and factionalized society, and the old guard was not going to surrender without a fight. The tension culminated in the year 1100 when the Duke's reign was brutally cut short. While traveling through a forest, he was ambushed and assassinated. The killer was a member of the rival Varshovist clan, but the act almost certainly had the tacit approval, if not the active encouragement, of other powerful nobles and disgruntled Premyslid relatives. It was a political murder, pure and simple, designed to stop a political program. The assassination achieved its immediate goal with terrifying efficiency. Bretislaus II was dead, and with him died his dream of an orderly succession. His reforms were immediately nullified, swept aside as if they had never existed. The powerful forces of tradition reasserted themselves with a vengeance. The duchy did not pass peacefully to his son. Instead, it was plunged back into the very cycle of internal warfare that Bretislaus had tried so desperately to break. The old system of lateral succession roared back to life, triggering a new round of bloody conflict among the Premyslid claimants that would consume Bohemia for another generation. The assassination sent a clear and chilling message to any future duke who might contemplate similar reforms. Challenging the entrenched interests of the aristocracy was a mortal danger. The death of Bretislaus II, therefore, is a powerful testament to the limits of a ruler's power. It demonstrates that even the most well-intentioned plans for stability could be utterly undone by the resistance of those who profit from chaos. A leader's vision for the future could quite literally be killed along with him, leaving behind a vacuum that would be filled by the very anarchy he sought to prevent. Now we shift our focus from the dynastic struggles of continental Europe to the wild, sea roads of the North Atlantic, where the fate of kingdoms could be decided on a distant, windswept shore. The story of King Magnus III of Norway, known to history as Magnus Barefoot, is a dramatic illustration of how a ruler's entire life's work can evaporate in an instant, not in the heart of his kingdom, but in a foreign land far from home. Magnus was the archetype of the Viking king, a throwback to an earlier age of expansion and conquest. His reign was defined not by building castles or codifying laws at home, but by a relentless, ambitious foreign policy aimed at reclaiming and expanding what he saw as Norway's historic dominion over the islands of the North Sea. He launched repeated campaigns to tighten his control over the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man, and he even asserted claims to parts of mainland Scotland and the coast of Ireland. His nickname, Barefoot, was said to come from his adoption of the Gaelic style of dress during these campaigns, symbolizing his deep personal investment in this project of Western Empire building. He was, in essence, a king who saw his destiny not just in ruling Norway, but in ruling a maritime empire. This grand ambition reached its peak and its abrupt end in the year 1103. Magnus had led a powerful fleet on a major raid along the coast of Ulster, in Ireland, a clear signal of his intent to project Norwegian power deep into the Irish Sea. But on a beach near Downpatrick, his forces were ambushed by a local Irish army. In the fierce skirmish that followed, the Viking king of Norway was killed, his body left on the Irish sand. The death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical cataclysm. In that single moment, Magnus's aggressive, personality-driven foreign policy died with him. The entire elaborate structure of alliances, tributary relationships, and military commitments he had built across the British Isles instantly lost its driving force and its central pillar. The king was gone, and there was no one of comparable stature or ambition to step into his shoes and continue his grand design. The reason for this sudden collapse lay back in Norway. Magnus left behind sons, but they were mere boys, far too young to lead armies or command the loyalty of hardened warriors. The kingdom did not pass smoothly to a capable successor. Instead, it plunged into the uncertain and often treacherous waters of a regency. Power was divided among competing aristocrats and bishops who ruled in the young king's names. Their priorities were inevitably inward-looking, focused on maintaining their own influence and managing the complex domestic politics of Norway itself, rather than pursuing costly and risky adventures overseas. The treasure and manpower that Magnus had lavished on his western campaigns were now needed at home to secure the regent's hold on power. The great fleet that had terrorized the Irish coast was recalled. Its warriors needed to guard against internal rivals. The imperial momentum that Magnus had generated came to a shuddering, complete halt. This dramatic inward shift in Norway's focus created a power vacuum across the sea, and nature abhors a vacuum. Other regional powers which had been contained or threatened by Magnus's expansionism suddenly found the pressure lifted. Most notably, the Kingdom of Scotland, under kings like Edgar and then Alexander I, saw a golden opportunity. With the Norwegian threat receding, they could move to consolidate their own authority over the mainland regions and islands that Magnus had contested. Scottish influence in the Hebrides and along the western coast grew steadily, a process that would have been unthinkable had Magnus Barefoot lived to continue his campaigns. The death of the Norwegian king on that Ulster beach was therefore a pivotal event not just for Norway, but for the entire political development of the British Isles. It allowed Scotland to emerge as the dominant native power in the north, fundamentally altering the future balance of power in the region. Magnus Barefoot's demise offers a particularly clear example of a specific kind of historical pivot, the death of a ruler on campaign. Unlike a king who dies peacefully in his bed, allowing for some preparation and a managed transition, a death in a foreign land is inherently destabilizing. It is sudden, unexpected, and occurs far from the centers of administrative power. There are no last-minute deathbed instructions, no quiet securing of loyalties. The news travels slowly, often accompanied by rumor and confusion, creating a window of opportunity for enemies and rivals alike. Magnus's story shows us that a ruler's grand strategy can be incredibly fragile, tethered not to institutions or long-term policies, but to the life of one individual. When that individual falls in a distant conflict, the strategy evaporates, and the geopolitical picture can be redrawn almost overnight. His death did not just end a reign, it ended an era of Norwegian expansion, demonstrating with stark clarity how the fate of empires could hinge on the outcome of a minor skirmish on a forgotten stretch of coastline. Our next shift transports us to the heart of 12th century France, to a world where the ambitions of local nobles were increasingly colliding with the grand strategies of rising monarchs. The county of Angoulême, nestled in the fertile landscape of southwestern France, might have seemed like a minor player on the surface. Yet the death of its ruler, Count William III, in the year 1148, would prove just how interconnected the feudal world had become. The Count's passing was not merely a local event. It was a spark that landed on the dry tinder of high-stakes politics, igniting a conflict that would reveal the shifting balance of power between the French crown and its most powerful subjects. The core of the problem was starkly simple. Count William died without a direct male heir. In the complex algebra of medieval inheritance, this equation had no simple solution. The county suddenly became a prize, and two formidable noble houses immediately stepped forward with competing claims. The first was the House of Taillefer, the very dynasty that had traditionally ruled Angoulême. They argued for the rights of a collateral branch, a cousin who could continue the ancient family line. The second claimant was the ambitious and notoriously aggressive House of Lusignan, a family whose power was on the rise and who based their claim on a marriage alliance. This was not just a legal dispute, it was a confrontation between old blood and new ambition, and with so much land and prestige at stake, a peaceful resolution was almost impossible. The local nobility quickly chose sides, and the county braced for a civil war that would be fought castle by castle. But the true significance of this crisis lay in the geography of power. Angoulême was strategically located, a coveted piece on the chessboard of southwestern France. More importantly, it was situated within the vast domains of the Duke of Aquitaine, who at this time was none other than Elena of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and influential women in all of medieval Europe. For the Duke of Aquitaine, control over a key county like Angoulême was a matter of vital importance. A strong, independent count could be a troublesome vassal, while a friendly count, perhaps one installed with the Duke's help, would extend Aquitanian influence and secure its borders. Elena and her husband, King Louis VII of France, naturally threw their support behind the Lusignan claim, seeing an opportunity to bind a powerful family to their cause and tighten their control over the region. This intervention, however, did not go unchallenged. The dispute over Angoulême attracted the attention of an even higher power, the King of France himself. But here, the situation reveals a fascinating complexity. The King of France, Louis VII, was also the husband of the Duchess of Aquitaine. In theory, their interests were aligned. In practice, the king was always wary of his mightiest vassals, even his own wife. The Duchy of Aquitaine was so large and rich that it rivaled the royal domain in power. Allowing the Duke and Duchess of Aquitaine to successfully install their preferred candidate in Angoulême would make them even stronger, potentially upsetting the delicate balance of power within the kingdom. Therefore, the French crown had its own vested interest in the outcome, not necessarily to support one claimant over the other, but to ensure that the resolution did not disproportionately empower the Duke of Aquitaine. The king's court became another arena where the fate of Angoulême was debated and influenced. What began as a quarrel between two local noble families was thus transformed into a proxy war, a single battle in the centuries-long struggle between the French monarchy and its great feudal princes. The conflict over Angoulême became a test case. Could the king prevent his most powerful vassal from expanding their influence? Or would the Duke of Aquitaine succeed in acting as a sovereign within their own lands, ignoring the wishes of the distant crown? The fighting on the ground in Angoulême was therefore amplified by diplomatic maneuvering, political pressure, and the looming threat of larger armies from Paris or Poitiers. The county's knights and castles became pieces in a game whose rules were being written far beyond their borders. The eventual outcome was a testament to the growing strength of centralized authority, but also to its limitations. After years of struggle, the Lusignan candidate, with the backing of Aquitaine, ultimately prevailed. However, this victory came at a cost. The long conflict had drained the county's resources and exposed its vulnerability. To secure his position, the new count had to acknowledge the overlordship of the Duke of Aquitaine more explicitly than his predecessors might have. binding Angoulême more tightly to the duchy. At the same time, the French king's attention had been firmly drawn to the region, setting a precedent for future royal intervention. The autonomy that Angoulême had once enjoyed was significantly weakened. It was no longer a fully independent actor but a subordinate territory within the Aquitanian sphere, which itself was now firmly in the sights of the French crown. The demise of Count William III, therefore, is a perfect case study in the slow, grinding process of state formation. His childless death did not create a dramatic, overnight change like a battle or a coronation. Instead, it created a crack in the local political structure, a small opening through which the larger forces of history poured. The conflict over his inheritance demonstrated that no feudal lord, no matter how seemingly insignificant, could escape the gravitational pull of the great powers. The fate of a small county like Angoulême was becoming inextricably linked to the grand narrative of France's centralization, a process where local identities and independent authorities were gradually, and often violently, absorbed into the growing body of the nation-state. It was a quiet, bureaucratic kind of power shift, but one whose consequences would echo for centuries. Now, let us sail north to where the North Sea meets the Atlantic, to a world of jagged coastlines, fierce winters, and a unique cultural fusion. Here, in the Orkney Islands and the northernmost reaches of mainland Scotland, the story of Earl Harald Maddadson unfolds, a masterclass in the art of political survival. For over half a century, from around 1138 until his death in 1206, Harald ruled a domain that was geographically and politically straddled between two worlds. His very identity was a bridge. His father was a Norse earl from Orkney, his mother a Scottish princess from the line of the kings of Scots. This dual heritage was not a weakness but the source of his remarkable strength. He was a man who understood the languages, customs, and ambitions of both the Norwegian court, to which Orkney officially belonged, and the Scottish crown, which was increasingly looking to expand its authority northward. His long reign was not a period of dramatic conquest, but one of skillful, delicate balance. He paid homage to the King of Norway as his sovereign lord for the earldom of Orkney, while simultaneously holding the title of Earl of Caithness on the Scottish mainland, for which he owed fealty to the King of Scots. Navigating this dual allegiance required the precision of a diplomat and the cunning of a chess grandmaster, constantly anticipating moves and countermoves to avoid being crushed between these two growing powers. Harald's success lay in his ability to be indispensable to both sides without being fully controlled by either. For the King of Norway, Harald was a reliable governor of a distant but strategically vital island chain, a guardian of the sea lanes and a representative of Norse culture and law. For the King of Scots, he was a powerful and influential northern magnate, whose cooperation could ease the gradual integration of the Highlands and Islands into the Scottish realm. Harald played this double role with astonishing dexterity. He could raise a fleet for a Norwegian campaign when required, yet he could also sit in council with Scottish kings, his voice carrying weight in the affairs of the mainland. He maintained a degree of autonomy that was the envy of other frontier lords, creating a stable, prosperous buffer zone that suited his own interests as much as those of his nominal superiors. His earldom became a place where Norse and Gaelic cultures coexisted and blended, a testament to his personal ability to hold competing forces in a productive tension. For nearly 70 years, he was the linchpin, the man who kept the peace in a volatile region simply through the force of his personality and his deep understanding of the political landscape. This delicate equilibrium, however, was entirely dependent on the man himself. The system he had built was a personal achievement, not an institutional one. It relied on his wisdom, his reputation, and the respect he commanded in both Oslo and Skåne. And so, when Earl Harald finally passed away in 1206, the entire structure he had sustained for so long began to tremble. The immediate consequence was not an invasion, but a fragmentation. Unlike a kingdom that might pass intact to a single heir, the custom in the Norse Gaelic world often led to partible inheritance, where territories were divided among multiple sons. This is precisely what happened to Harald's domain. His earldoms were split between his surviving sons, a common practice intended to provide for all members of the family, but one that almost always led to a catastrophic dilution of power. Where there had been one powerful earl governing a unified territory from the islands to the mainland, there were now 2 or 3 weaker earls, each controlling a smaller portion. Instead of presenting a united front to external powers, the brothers often turned on each other, squabbling over borders and resources, their rivalries making them vulnerable in a way their father never was. This internal division was the opportunity the Scottish crown had been waiting for. King Alexander II, who came to the throne in 1214, was a monarch with a clear vision of a unified Scotland, and the fragmented earldom of Caithness was a glaring anomaly on his map. With the sons of Harald Maddadson distracted by their own disputes, they were in no position to resist the steady, creeping advance of Scottish royal authority. Alexander and his agents could now intervene in local conflicts, acting as arbiters and slowly imposing Scottish law and administration over the mainland parts of the old earldom. They could play the brothers against one another, offering support to one in exchange for concessions that eroded the earldom's traditional autonomy. The once formidable buffer zone that Harald had maintained was now cracked and brittle. The decline of direct Norse influence, which had been held at bay by Harald's loyalty to Norway, now accelerated rapidly. The King of Norway was too distant and too preoccupied with his own problems to effectively support the feuding heirs of his once great Earl. The passing of the master tightrope walker, therefore, did not cause an immediate collapse, but it removed the one figure capable of maintaining the balance. His death initiated a slow-motion power shift, a gradual but inexorable process where the Scottish crown filled the vacuum he left behind, weaving the northern territories ever more tightly into the fabric of the Scottish kingdom and quietly ending an era of Norse dominion in the north. This intricate dance of inheritance and imperial ambition brings us to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, to a story that reveals a fundamental difference in the very nature of medieval property and power. The Zähringen dynasty were not minor lords, they were major players, dukes in the strategically vital region of Swabia, and their influence stretched across what is now southwestern Germany and northern Switzerland. For generations, they had been key power brokers, their loyalty and military strength sought after by emperors. Their authority was built on 2 distinct types of land. The first was the ducal title itself, a formal office granted by the emperor which came with specific fiefs, lands they held in exchange for sworn loyalty and service. But perhaps more important was their second source of power, their vast allodial lands. These were properties owned outright, free and clear, with no feudal superior above them. This allodial land was the family's private fortune, the bedrock of their independence and the true source of their wealth, passed down from generation to generation as their personal patrimony. The stability of this entire arrangement rested on a simple, biological premise, the presence of a male heir. For decades, Duke Conrad I of Zähringen governed his territories with skill, navigating the treacherous waters of imperial politics. But as he grew older, a looming problem became impossible to ignore. The Duke had no sons. In a society where political authority and land ownership were almost exclusively patrilineal, this was a catastrophe in the making. The intricate system of feudal law had a clear, if brutal, answer for what happened to each type of his property upon his death in 1152. The ducal title and the fiefs associated with it were not truly his to give away. They were revocable grants from the emperor. When Conrad died without a male heir to step into his shoes, that contract with the emperor was effectively void. The title of Duke of Zähringen and the lands tied to it simply lapsed, reverting back to the imperial treasury, so to speak. The current emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, a man fiercely dedicated to consolidating his own power, now had a golden opportunity. He could take this vacant duchy and its resources and grant them to a more loyal or strategically useful ally, effectively erasing the Zähringens from the highest tier of imperial aristocracy. But the fate of the allodial land, the family's private property, was a different matter entirely. This land was not subject to the emperor's whims. According to custom and law, it could be inherited by Conrad's daughters. And so it was. The vast Zähringen allodial patrimony was divided among his heiresses. Yet this was not a path to continued dynastic power for the Zähringen name. In the 12th century, a woman's inheritance didn't typically empower her to rule in her own right. Instead, it was transferred to the control of her husband upon marriage. Each daughter's share of the Zähringen wealth became a magnificent dowry, a prize that was absorbed into the estates of the noble family she married into. One branch might go to the Counts of Urach, another to the Dukes of Teck, and so on. The solid, contiguous block of land that had formed the core of Zähringen power was now fragmented, splintered into several pieces and scattered to the winds through the intricate web of aristocratic marriage alliances. The consequence of Duke Conrad's death, therefore, was a double dissolution. Politically, the dynasty ceased to be a ducal power. The title was gone, and with it, their formal seat at the table of the empire's greatest princes. Territorially, their private wealth was broken apart and assimilated into the portfolios of other rising families. The Zähringen name, once spoken with respect and caution, began to fade from prominence almost overnight. It was a quiet extinction, not marked by a dramatic battle or a bloody revolt, but by the silent, inexorable workings of inheritance law. This case is a masterclass in the distinction between office and property in the Middle Ages. It shows that a family could be incredibly powerful one day and politically irrelevant the next, not because they were defeated, but because their bloodline simply failed to produce a son. The Emperor Frederick Barbarossa emerged as the ultimate beneficiary. By redistributing the Zähringen titles and fiefs, he strengthened his own network of supporters and tightened his grip on Swabia, demonstrating how the personal tragedy of one dynasty could become a building block for the centralization of imperial authority. The disappearance of the Zähringens created space for new powers to rise, permanently reshaping the political landscape of southwestern Germany and serving as a sobering reminder that in the medieval world, the future of a great house was always just one generation away from oblivion. To truly grasp the shockwave caused by Prince Vsevolod's death, we need to understand the unique and often bewildering political system of the Kievan Rus. This was not a centralized kingdom like France or England, but a vast, sprawling federation of principalities, all ruled by different branches of the same sprawling family, the Rurikid dynasty. Think of it less as a single state and more as a constantly shifting family corporation, where the various branches were perpetually competing for the most lucrative assets. The Grand Princely Throne of Kiev was the ultimate prize, the symbolic and economic heart of the Rus world. It was a position of seniority and immense prestige, but it did not grant the kind of absolute power a Western European king might expect. Instead, the Grand Prince was more like a first among equals. a senior partner tasked with coordinating the defense of the Federation and managing the complex and often contentious relationships between his numerous relatives ruling cities like Novgorod, Vladimir, and Chernigov. This system was governed by a peculiar and inherently unstable principle of succession known as the rota system, or the ladder of succession. Inheritance did not simply pass from father to son. Instead, the right to rule was meant to circulate among the senior princes of the entire Rurikid clan, theoretically moving from an older brother to a younger brother, then to cousins, before eventually winding its way down to the next generation. In theory, this was meant to ensure that the most experienced and senior member of the family always held the reins of power in Kiev, but in practice, it was a recipe for perpetual tension. Every prince was constantly calculating his own position in the line of succession, and any death within the senior ranks would trigger a frantic and violent reshuffling of the entire political deck. Ambitious younger princes were often unwilling to wait their turn, while those currently in power were always looking for ways to bypass the system and secure Kiev for their own direct sons, setting the stage for betrayal and civil war. Into this volatile arena stepped Vsevolod Olgovich, the Prince of Chernigov. He was a master of this brutal political game. Through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, strategic marriages, and decisive military action, he managed to outmaneuver his rivals and seize the grand princely throne of Kiev for himself in the year 1139. His reign of 7 years was a testament to his political skill, as he worked to balance the competing interests of the other princes and maintain a fragile unity. He understood that his authority rested on a knife's edge, dependent on a network of alliances and the constant demonstration of his strength. For a time, he managed to keep the lid on the simmering pot of dynastic ambition. But the entire structure was a personal achievement built on Vsevolod's own energy and cunning. The system itself had no institutional strength to sustain it once he was gone. When Vsevolod succumbed to illness in the spring of 1146, the delicate equilibrium he had maintained shattered instantly. The power struggle was immediate and twofold. The first and most obvious contest was for the grand princely throne in Kiev itself. With the senior prince dead, the rota system was activated, and every prince with a conceivable claim saw a golden opportunity. But the crisis did not stop at the gates of Kiev. Vsevolod's own hereditary principality of Chernigov, which he had ruled before becoming Grand Prince, was also now up for grabs. According to the complex rules, it should have passed to the next eligible prince in the Olgovichi branch of the family. But Vsevolod had a brother, Igor, and he also had his own sons. Would the principality follow the lateral succession of the rota system, or would Vsevolod's direct line try to hold onto their paternal inheritance? This dual vacuum, one in Kiev and one in Chernigov, created a vortex of conflict that pulled the entire federation into a state of civil war. The resulting instability could not have come at a worse time. To the south and east, along the vast Pontic steppe, lurked a constant and existential threat: the nomadic Turkic tribes known as the Cumans. For generations, these skilled horsemen had been the primary external enemy of the Rus principalities, launching devastating raids deep into their territories, capturing slaves and plundering wealth. The only effective defense against these swift and unpredictable attacks was a unified front. The princes needed to coordinate their armies, man a chain of fortifications along the river frontiers, and present a solid wall of resistance. But with the Rurikid princes now turning their armies against each other in a desperate scramble for power, that unified front completely collapsed. The defensive lines were left unmanned as soldiers were recalled to fight in the internal dynastic wars. The Cumans, quick to perceive this weakness, seized the opportunity, launching deeper and more destructive raids than they had dared in years. The internal power struggle, triggered by one man's death, thus directly led to the suffering of the entire population of the southern principalities, who were left exposed and vulnerable. The sudden demise of Prince Vsevolod Olgovich, therefore, is a perfect case study in the chronic volatility that plagued the Kievan Rus. It exemplifies a political system where the death of a senior leader was not a moment of orderly transition, but a moment of systemic reset. The entire political order was thrown back to a state of nature, a war of all against all, where the strongest or most cunning contender would emerge victorious, at least until the next death triggered the cycle all over again. This inherent weakness, this inability to create a stable and predictable succession mechanism, would be the Federation's undoing. The constant internal strife sapped its collective strength, prevented long-term planning, and left it perpetually vulnerable to external threats. Within a century of Vsevolod's death, the Mongol invasions would arrive, and the fractured, feuding principalities of the Rus would find themselves unable to unite, leading to their eventual subjugation. The power vacuum created by a single illness in 1146 was a preview of the greater catastrophe to come, a stark reminder that a house divided against itself cannot stand. The year 1187 presented a scene of almost unimaginable catastrophe for the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. The dust had barely settled on the horns of Hattin, where in July the combined armies of the kingdom had been annihilated by the forces of Saladin. The true cross, the sacred spiritual standard of the Christian army, was lost. King Guy of Jerusalem and a host of the most important nobles were now prisoners of the triumphant Sultan. And in the wake of this unprecedented victory, Saladin's armies were sweeping across the land, picking off the now undefended castles and cities of the kingdom with terrifying speed. Acre, Sidon, Beirut, Jaffa, they fell one after another, their garrisons depleted or demoralized. It seemed as if the entire century-long project of the Crusader states was on the verge of complete and irreversible collapse. In this moment of absolute despair, the beleaguered defenders, clinging to the last strongholds like Tyre and the ultimate prize, the city of Jerusalem itself, looked desperately for a leader, for someone with the experience, the diplomatic skill, and the sheer force of will to organize a defense or negotiate terms of survival. All eyes turned to the north, to the county of Tripoli, and to the one man who might have been able to salvage something from the wreckage, Count Raymond III. Raymond of Tripoli was a figure who embodied the complex, often tragic history of the Crusader states. He was not just any baron, he was a prince of the blood, a cousin to the royal family, and for years he had been the most powerful and experienced politician in Outremer. His career had been defined by a fierce, pragmatic realism. Most famously, he had served as regent for the remarkable leper king, Baldwin IV, during the king's minority and periods of debilitating illness. In that role, Raymond had been the steady hand on the tiller, advocating for a policy of cautious coexistence with Saladin. He understood better than anyone that the kingdom's survival depended on avoiding a single, decisive battle, on playing a long game of diplomacy and limited conflict. He had warned against the very kind of reckless military adventure that led to the disaster at Hattin. His rivalry with the impetuous faction led by Guy of Lusignan and Reynold of Chatillon was the central political drama of the kingdom in the years leading up to the battle. At one point, this rivalry had even flared into open conflict, a civil war that dangerously divided Christian forces on the eve of Saladin's greatest offensive. Though he had reluctantly reconciled with King Guy before Hattin, his advice to avoid a direct confrontation was ignored, with the consequences now plain for all to see. In the aftermath of the battle, Raymond's position was uniquely tragic. He was one of the few major Christian leaders to escape the field of Hattin alive, having led his own contingent in a desperate cavalry charge that managed to break through the Muslim lines. He retreated to his northern stronghold of Tripoli, a county that was now more vulnerable than ever. Yet, even in this darkest hour, he represented the last best hope. He possessed an intimate knowledge of Saladin, his strategies, and his weaknesses, born from years of both warfare and negotiation. He commanded the respect of the remaining knights and burghers. Most importantly, he had the stature to potentially unite the shattered remnants of the kingdom's leadership, to organize a coordinated defense of the last remaining fortresses, and to open a credible diplomatic channel with the victorious Sultan. He might have been able to negotiate a surrender of Jerusalem that spared its inhabitants, or to rally a defense of Tyre so formidable that Saladin would have to reconsider his goal of total conquest. In a situation teetering on the brink of total annihilation, Raymond was the one pillar that had not yet crumbled. Then, just a few months after the catastrophe he had tried so hard to prevent, fate delivered its final, cruel blow. In the autumn of 1187, Count Raymond III fell ill, possibly with pleurisy, and died. His death was not on a glorious battlefield. It was a quiet, inglorious end from sickness, a stark contrast to the violent demise of so many of his peers. But its impact was more devastating than any military defeat. With Raymond gone, the last vestige of experienced, centralized leadership evaporated. The defense of the Crusader states now fell to a handful of isolated commanders and a few newly arrived crusaders from Europe, men who lacked Raymond's deep understanding of the local political and military landscape. There was no one left who could speak with authority for the entire kingdom. The resistance became fragmented, atomized. The heroic defense of Tyre, for instance, was orchestrated by Conrad of Montferrat, a capable and determined Italian nobleman who had fortuitously arrived just in time, but he was an outsider without Raymond's deep-rooted authority or his relationships with the other barons. The most poignant consequence of Raymond's absence was felt in Jerusalem. The city was left under the command of an undistinguished knight, Balian of Ibelin, who had been granted special permission by Saladin to enter the city unarmed to retrieve his family, only to be begged by the desperate populace to stay and lead the defense. Balian performed miracles with virtually no resources, but he was a local baron, not a regent or a prince. He had no power to negotiate from a position of strength. When it became clear that defense was hopeless, he had to parley with Saladin directly without the backing of any higher authority. The surrender of Jerusalem, while negotiated with remarkable chivalry by Saladin's standards, was ultimately a unilateral capitulation. One cannot help but wonder if Raymond of Tripoli, with his history of dealing with the Sultan, could have secured better terms or perhaps even coordinated a regional strategy that might have saved more of the kingdom. His death removed that possibility entirely. The passing of this one seasoned leader did not just mark the end of a man. It marked the end of an era of coherent strategy and the final extinguishing of any hope for an organized recovery. The fragile realm, already shattered by the sword at Hattin, now found its last potential savior gone, leaving it to be gathered up piece by its victorious foe. The scene in Denmark in the middle of the 12th century was one of pure, unadulterated chaos, a classic example of a kingdom tearing itself apart. For years, the country had been fractured into rival domains, not by foreign invasion, but by the ambitions of its own princes. Instead of one king, there were three, each controlling a slice of the realm and each claiming the right to rule it all. This was the long and bitter Danish Civil War, a period where brotherhood and loyalty were sacrificed on the altar of power. On one side was Sweyn III, a ruthless and ambitious ruler. On another was Valdemar, the son of a saintly murdered prince who held his own territory and bided his time. And caught between these two formidable figures was our focus, King Canute V. Canute was a young king, a grandson of the famous King Niels, and he represented a legitimate but vulnerable branch of the royal family. His power base was in the islands of Denmark, but his authority was constantly challenged. For a time, he and Valdemar had formed an alliance against the domineering Sweyn, a partnership of necessity against a common enemy. But the political landscape was a shifting sand dune, and alliances were as fragile as glass. Exhausted by the constant fighting that was bleeding the country dry, the three rivals made a fateful decision. They agreed to meet for a peace banquet in the city of Richilde in the year 1157. The intention was noble, to divide the kingdom into three clear, sovereign regions, each king ruling his own part, and in doing so, to finally bring an end to the destructive war. It was a desperate gamble for stability. The feast began with all the appearances of goodwill and reconciliation. The great hall would have been filled with the sounds of celebration, the clinking of goblets, and the hopeful talk of a future without conflict. But beneath the surface, a monstrous betrayal was brewing. Sweyn III had no intention of honoring the agreement. He saw the banquet not as a peace conference, but as the perfect trap. In the midst of the festivities, on his signal, his armed guards burst into the hall and turned on the unsuspecting guests. The celebration instantly became a slaughterhouse. Canute V, who had come to the table in good faith, was cut down and murdered by the men of his rival. This horrific event, forever remembered as the blood feast of Richilde, stands as one of the most treacherous acts in Danish history, a stark lesson in the brutal realities of medieval power politics. Sweyn's immediate goal was achieved. With one swift, brutal act, he had eliminated a direct competitor for the throne. He likely believed that this shocking display of ruthlessness would terrify the remaining opposition into submission, that the murder of Canute would be the final, decisive stroke that would make him the sole master of Denmark. But history often has a way of turning a perpetrator's greatest triumph into their ultimate undoing. The assassination did not have the effect Sweyn intended. Instead of cowing the kingdom into obedience, the blood feast backfired spectacularly. The treacherous murder of a king under the sacred promise of a peace banner revolted the Danish nobility and the church. Sweyn was now revealed not as a strong ruler, but as a dishonorable oath-breaker, a man who could not be trusted. The very brutality meant to secure his power instead stripped him of his legitimacy in the eyes of his most important supporters. This sudden shift in the political wind created the perfect conditions for the third king, Valdemar, to emerge as the hero of the hour. Valdemar had narrowly escaped the massacre at Richilde, and the event transformed his position entirely. Where before he was one claimant among three, he was now the sole surviving rival to the despised Sweyn. More importantly, he became the natural focus for all the outrage and fear that Sweyn's treachery had provoked. The nobles who were appalled by the bloodshed, the churchmen who saw it as a sacrilege, and the common people weary of lawlessness, all now looked to Valdemar as the instrument of justice and the only hope for a stable future. Canute's murder, therefore, did not simplify the war, it completely reframed it. The conflict was no longer a three-sided squabble for power. It was now a clear-cut moral crusade, a fight between a treacherous usurper and a righteous avenger. Valdemar seized this opportunity with brilliant skill. He rallied the kingdom to his cause, and later that same year, 1157, he confronted Sweyn's army at the Battle of Graith Heath. The fight was fierce, but Valdemar's forces, fueled by a sense of righteous cause, were victorious. Sweyn was killed during the retreat, his reign of terror ended almost as suddenly as it had begun. With both his rivals gone, Valdemar I was now the undisputed king of a united Denmark. The violent power shift that began with a dagger in a banquet hall had, through a strange and bloody logic, culminated in the resolution of a generations-long conflict. Valdemar's long reign became the foundation of the Valdemarian Age, a golden period for Denmark marked by internal peace, territorial expansion, and the strengthening of royal authority. The death of Canute V, a seemingly senseless act of treachery, proved to be a paradoxical catalyst for unity. It eliminated a key player, but more importantly, it discredited a tyrant and cleared the path for a leader who could finally bind the nation's wounds, demonstrating that sometimes the darkest deeds can inadvertently pave the way for the dawn. Wales in the late 12th century was a land perpetually under threat, a patchwork of ancient kingdoms struggling to maintain their identity against the relentless pressure of a powerful and expansionist England. In this world of looming shadows, one figure stood out as a beacon of Welsh resilience and statecraft: Lord Rhys ap Griffith, the ruler of Deheubarth in the south. His contemporaries and history itself would honor him with the simple, respectful title of the Lord Rhys, a testament to the unique authority he commanded. For over 4 decades, from 1155 to 1197, Rhys navigated a political tightrope of breathtaking difficulty. He was a contemporary of the formidable Plantagenet kings of England, Henry II and his son Richard the Lionheart, monarchs whose resources and ambitions dwarfed his own. Yet, through a masterful blend of shrewd diplomacy and calculated military strength, Rhys did not just survive, he thrived. He understood that outright, permanent defiance of the English crown was a path to certain destruction. Instead, he adopted a policy of pragmatic accommodation when necessary, formally acknowledging the King of England as his overlord, a move that granted him the space to consolidate his own power without provoking a full-scale invasion. This diplomatic recognition was not a sign of weakness, but a shield behind which Rhys could build. He used periods of peace to strengthen his castles, foster trade, and patronize Welsh culture, making his court at Dyneford a renowned center of learning and religion. He was a key supporter of the burgeoning Cistercian order in Wales, and he presided over the first recorded national Eisteddfod, a festival of poetry and music that celebrated the very soul of Welsh identity. But his diplomacy was always backed by a readiness to fight. When English power wavered or when his autonomy was directly threatened, Rhys was quick to take up arms, leading his armies on successful campaigns that expanded his influence across much of southern and western Wales. At the height of his power, he was effectively the most powerful native ruler in the country, a prince who could negotiate with the English king from a position of strength and command the respect, if not always the outright obedience, of the other Welsh princes. He created a fragile but very real unity, a sense that under his leadership Wales could chart its own course. The entire edifice of this remarkable achievement, however, was built upon a foundation of personal authority. The stability of Deheubarth, and by extension the Welsh resistance, depended almost entirely on the charisma, wisdom, and iron will of Lord Rhys himself. He was the linchpin holding everything together, and this is what makes the circumstances of his death in 1197 so profoundly consequential. The Lord Rhys was not just an old man passing away, he was the central pillar of a political structure, and when he was removed, the structure collapsed inward with terrifying speed. The immediate and catastrophic problem was one of succession. Like many medieval rulers, Rhys had ensured the continuation of his line by fathering a large number of sons. But what was meant to be a dynasty's greatest strength, an abundance of male heirs, became its fatal weakness in the absence of a clear and universally accepted succession plan. The Welsh laws of inheritance, known as Cyfraith Hywel, favoured a system of partible inheritance where a lord's lands were divided among all his sons. This was intended to provide for the entire family, but it was a recipe for fragmentation and conflict. Unlike the primogeniture system increasingly adopted in England, where the eldest son inherited the entirety to preserve the power of the estate, the Welsh custom guaranteed that every generation would see the division of territories. Lord Rhys had attempted to impose order on this inherently unstable system by naming his eldest son, Griffith, as his primary heir, but this went against tradition and, more importantly, it ignited the bitter jealousy of his younger sons, who saw their own inheritances and future prospects being diminished. The final years of Rhys's long life were actually marred by this growing tension, as his sons began to jockey for position, their rivalries threatening to break into open warfare even before their father was in his grave. When the Lord Rhys finally died, the dam of paternal authority broke completely. The delicate balance he had maintained for decades evaporated overnight. The respect and fear that had kept his sons in check was gone, replaced by a frantic, bloody scramble for power. The unified kingdom of Deheubarth did not pass peacefully to a single successor. Instead, it was torn apart by a brutal civil war among the brothers. They turned their weapons on each other, fighting over castles, lands, and the title of ruler. This was not a single battle, but a prolonged, chaotic struggle that ravaged the Welsh countryside and exhausted the military strength that Rhys had so carefully husbanded. The very warriors who should have been guarding the borders against English incursions were now killing each other in a fratricidal conflict that shattered the illusion of Welsh unity. This internal self-destruction created an opportunity that the English crown had been waiting for. King John, who had ascended the English throne in 1199, was a ruler known for his cunning and his relentless desire to exert royal control over all of Britain. The civil war in Deheubarth was a gift. He was no longer facing the formidable, unified front of Lord Rhys. Instead, he was presented with a group of warring, vulnerable princes, each desperate for any advantage over their brothers. King John skillfully inserted himself into the conflict, not as a conqueror leading an army, but as a manipulative overlord playing the brothers against one another. He would offer support and recognition to one son, then withdraw it and back another, ensuring that the Welsh remained divided and dependent on his favor. He used their desperation to extract ever greater concessions, slowly eroding the autonomy that Rhys had preserved. By the time the fratricidal strife had burned itself out, the kingdom of Deheubarth was a shadow of its former self, its territory fractured, its resources depleted, and its princes transformed from independent rulers into clients of the English king. The decades of patient state building by the Lord Rhys were undone in a few short years, proving with tragic clarity that the achievements of even the most brilliant leader could be utterly reversed when his legacy was left in the hands of a generation that valued personal ambition over national survival. While the Crusades are often remembered as epic clashes of faith between Christendom and Islam, they were also moments of profound vulnerability for the European lords who embarked on them, a lesson tragically exemplified by the fate of Count Philip I of Flanders. Philip was no minor noble. He was one of the wealthiest and most formidable princes of his age, a man whose ambitions stretched across the map of Western Europe. His domains were a formidable bloc, the rich, commercially vibrant county of Flanders, a center of the cloth trade that gave him immense financial power, and the strategically critical county of Vermandois, which lay like a wedge into the heart of the French royal domain. Philip's influence was such that he had meddled in the politics of England, served as a regent for the young King Philip Augustus of France, and was a key architect of the coalition that launched the Third Crusade after the disaster at Hattin. He arrived at the Siege of Acre in the Holy Land in 1191, not as a secondary commander, but as a leader whose military and financial contributions were essential to the entire enterprise. Yet, far from the familiar landscapes of his power, his formidable presence counted for little against an invisible enemy. Like so many crusaders before him, he fell victim not to a Saracen blade, but to disease, succumbing to illness in the pestilential conditions of the Crusader camp. His death was a significant blow to the Christian effort, but its most far-reaching consequences would be felt not in the Holy Land, but back in the courts and castles of France. The political earthquake triggered by Philip's death was immediate and immense, for he died without a direct heir. He had no sons to inherit his titles, and his marriage had produced no children. This created a succession crisis of the highest order. His vast and lucrative territories were suddenly without a clear ruler, transforming them from a bastion of a powerful dynasty into the greatest prize in European politics. The two main claimants were his sister, Margaret, and her husband, Count Baldwin V of Hainaut. They had a strong, direct familial claim to the inheritance. But standing in the wings, watching with the intense focus of a predator, was the young King Philip Augustus of France. The king had once been under the thumb of his powerful vassals, including the Count of Flanders during his minority. Now he was a ruler of growing cunning and ambition, determined to strengthen the French crown at the expense of its overmighty subjects. The Count of Flanders' demise presented him with an opportunity he had scarcely dared to dream of. King Philip Augustus did not simply rely on legal arguments or brute force. He employed a masterful strategy of political and legal maneuvering. As the ultimate feudal overlord for the county of Vermandois, he had a direct interest in its fate. He skillfully exploited the complex web of feudal law, arguing that certain parts of the inheritance, particularly lands held as a fief from the crown, should revert to the royal domain if there was no direct male heir, a legal principle known as escheat. He moved with breathtaking speed and precision, presenting Margaret and Baldwin with a fait accompli in Vermandois before they could even fully consolidate their position. He occupied key castles and towns not as a conqueror, but as a sovereign enforcing his lawful rights. The Count's sister and her husband, facing the overwhelming power and legal arguments of the crown, and likely preoccupied with securing their hold on Flanders itself, were forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. The Treaty of Arras, signed in the aftermath, was a landmark victory for the French monarchy. King Philip Augustus succeeded in annexing a huge portion of the Vermandois, including the strategically vital cities of Arras, Amiens, and Saint-Quentin, directly into the royal domain. This was not a temporary gain. It was a permanent and massive expansion of the territory directly controlled by the King of France. The incorporation of these lands dramatically increased the crown's revenues, its military resources, and its strategic depth. For the first time in centuries, the French king's personal power base was no longer just the small region around Paris, the Isle de France. It now extended decisively northward, encircling and dwarfing the territories of his other great vassals. The balance of power in northern France had been fundamentally and permanently altered. The death of a crusading count on a distant shore had, through the ruthless genius of his king, become the single most important step in the rise of Capetian France, setting the stage for the century-long project of centralization that would eventually forge the modern French state. To understand the true impact of King Inge I's death, we must first step into the world of 12th century Norway, a kingdom trapped in a cycle of violence so relentless it would become known simply as the Civil War era. This was not a single conflict but a sprawling, multi-generational struggle that pitted rival branches of the royal family against one another in a brutal contest for the throne. The root of the problem lay in Norway's unique and deeply flawed laws of succession. Unlike kingdoms that were moving toward primogeniture, where the crown passed cleanly from father to eldest son, Norway operated under a tradition that seemed almost designed to encourage chaos. This was the law of the Ledang, the idea that any royal son, whether born in or out of wedlock, had an equal right to claim the throne. In theory, this was meant to ensure a strong leader emerged from the royal bloodline. In practice, it was a recipe for perpetual civil war. Every time a king died, it was not a signal for a peaceful transition, but a starting pistol for a free-for-all, where every man with a drop of royal blood and a band of armed supporters could make a bid for power, turning the entire country into a battlefield where brother fought against cousin and uncle against nephew. King Ingi I was a product of this brutal system. He was one of the many sons of the formidable King Harald, and from a young age he was thrust into the heart of the conflict. For years he ruled as a co-king, sharing power in an unstable and tense arrangement with his brothers. This was a common, if dysfunctional, attempt to manage the competing claims, but it was a fragile peace that rarely lasted. One by one, his brothers fell in battle or through assassination, until Ingi found himself as the senior reigning monarch, the man trying to hold the center against a new wave of challengers. His primary opponent was a young pretender known as Håkon Herdebreid, which translates to Håkon the Broad-Shouldered. Håkon was the son of another of Ingi's half-brothers, and he represented the next generation of claimants, his very existence a challenge to Ingi's hard-won authority. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation that each man believed would end the war and secure the throne for his line. This confrontation came in 1161 near the city of Oslo, at a place called the Battle of Oslo. The two armies clashed, and in the fierce melee, the tide of battle turned against King Ingi. The details are sparse, but the saga's record that he was struck down and killed, a reigning king falling in combat against his own people. In the logic of so many of our other stories, this should have been the end of it. The elimination of the main claimant should have allowed the victor, Håkon Herdebreid, to consolidate his power and bring a weary peace to Norway. But the Civil War era operated on a different, more vicious logic. Ingi's death did not resolve the conflict, it supercharged it. The vacuum created by his fall was not an empty space waiting to be filled, but a whirlpool that dragged new contenders into the fray. The faction that had supported Ingi did not simply disband and swear loyalty to Håkon. Instead, they immediately rallied around a new figurehead, Ingi's nephew, another prince with a claim, who would continue the fight under the banner of avenging his fallen uncle. What followed was not peace but an escalation. The war, which had already drained Norway for decades, intensified and dragged on for another half-century. The constant fighting had a catastrophic effect on the kingdom. Royal authority, the very concept of a central government that could enforce laws and collect taxes, became a joke. The kingdom's resources were not spent on building roads, fostering trade, or defending the coast from foreign threats. Instead, they were consumed by the endless internal struggle. Treasure was spent on hiring mercenaries, crops were burned to starve out rivals, and the young men who should have been farmers and fishermen were sent to die in battles that decided nothing except which warlord would call himself king for a few more years. This prolonged weakness made Norway a spectator in the geopolitics of the North Sea. While the kingdoms of Denmark and Sweden grew stronger and more centralized, Norway remained fractured and inward-looking. its potential squandered in a seemingly endless cycle of self-destruction. The death of King Ingi I, therefore, stands as a stark counterpoint to the idea that a single death can bring clarity. In a stable political system, the passing of a monarch is a moment of transition, often managed by established laws and institutions. But in a system already broken by contested succession, a king's death can be like throwing gasoline on a fire. It demonstrates that a power vacuum does not always lead to a quick resolution. Sometimes it simply deepens the existing divisions, giving every minor faction a new reason to fight, and ensuring that the violence becomes a self-perpetuating feature of political life. Ingi's fall did not mark the end of Norway's civil wars. It merely opened a new and even more destructive chapter, proving that the most tragic power shifts are those that offer no hope of an end, only the promise of more bloodshed to come. Our journey through these sudden power shifts has been dominated by chaos, by assassinations, unexpected deaths, and the violent scrambles that followed. But the story of Duke Ottokar IV of Styria offers a fascinating exception, a case study in how a looming tragedy could be managed with foresight to achieve a peaceful and transformative outcome. In the late 12th century, the Duchy of Styria, a rugged and strategically vital territory in the southeastern Alps, was ruled by the ancient Ottokar dynasty. Their power seemed secure, but it was about to face an existential threat not from a foreign army, but from a personal and incurable illness. The young Duke Ottokar contracted leprosy, a disease that in the medieval world was not just a physical sentence but a social and political one. As the years passed and his condition worsened, it became horrifyingly clear to his courtiers, his neighbors, and to Ottokar himself that he would not live to old age, and most critically, he would never produce an heir. The future of his entire dynasty, which had governed Styria for centuries, was now shadowed by the specter of extinction. This personal calamity created a ticking clock, a period of anxious uncertainty where the fate of a sovereign duchy hung in the balance. It was in this atmosphere of impending doom that cold, calculating statecraft took over. The most powerful figure in the region was Leopold V, the ambitious Duke of Austria from the rising house of Babenberg. Leopold saw in Ottokar's tragic predicament not just a human tragedy, but a geopolitical opportunity of the highest order. An independent Styria acted as a buffer between his Austrian lands and the expanding kingdom of Hungary to the east. If Styria were to fall into the wrong hands after Ottokar's death, perhaps claimed by a Hungarian king or fragmented by internal nobles, it could threaten Austria's security. But if it could be joined to Austria, it would create an unbroken block of territory, a powerful marchland that would make the Babenbergs the dominant force in the entire southeastern part of the Holy Roman Empire. The incentive for a peaceful union was immense for both parties. For the ailing Ottokar, it offered a way to ensure his duchy did not descend into a bloody succession war, preserving the peace for his people and perhaps his own legacy. For Leopold, it was the chance of a lifetime to expand his domain without drawing a sword. The result of these calculations was the Georgianberg Pact of 1186. This was not a treaty forced by a victorious army, but a carefully negotiated agreement, a prenuptial contract for territories. In it, the childless Duke Ottokar named Duke Leopold V of Austria as his heir. Upon Ottokar's death, the entire Duchy of Styria would pass irrevocably to the House of Babenberg. This was a monumental decision. Ottokar was effectively willing the independence of his homeland out of existence to ensure its orderly future. The pact was a masterpiece of political foresight, designed to prevent the very kind of violent power vacuum we have seen so often. It gave the nobility of Styria and Austria years to adjust to the new reality, and it sent a clear signal to potential external predators like Hungary that Styria was already spoken for. The agreement transformed a looming crisis into a managed transition. When Duke Ottokar IV finally succumbed to his illness in 1192, the political outcome was anticlimactic, and that was precisely the point. There were no armies massing on the border, no rival claimants fighting in the courts. There was only the smooth, uncontested activation of the Georgianburg Pact. Leopold V, or more accurately his son, Leopold VI, who had succeeded him by then, simply took possession of the duchy. The union of Austria and Styria was now a fact. This merger created a formidable new power bloc within the Holy Roman Empire, a contiguous territory that stretched from the Danube deep into the Alpine valleys, controlling vital trade routes and strategic mountain passes. The Babenberg dukes were suddenly elevated from important regional players to princes of the first rank. Their power base more than doubled in size. This consolidation laid the essential groundwork that would, generations later, make the region a nucleus around which the powerful Habsburg Empire could coalesce. The peaceful passing of the last Ottokar Duke, therefore, demonstrates a sophisticated alternative to the chaos of sudden death. It reveals that medieval politics was not solely about brute force, it was also about legal instruments and strategic planning. In this case, the anticipation of a ruler's demise became a tool, allowing for a deliberate and monumental redrawing of the map that would echo for centuries to come. But even the most prosperous and stable of reigns can be built upon a foundation of personal secrets that, upon the ruler's death, crack open to unleash chaos. This was the fate that awaited the Principality of Halych, a rich and strategically vital territory nestled in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, in what is now western Ukraine. For over 3 decades, its ruler, Prince Yaroslav Osmomysl, had been a model of effective leadership. His nickname, which translates to "of sharp mind," was well earned. He fostered trade, strengthened his army, and maintained generally good relations with his powerful neighbors, the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. Under his rule, Halych grew wealthy and secure, a beacon of order in the often turbulent world of the Rus principalities. Yet behind this public success festered a deep and corrosive private conflict, a family drama centered on the prince's heir, his legitimate son, Vladimirko. The relationship between father and son was poisonous, degenerating into such bitter hostility that Yaroslav eventually had his own boy thrown into prison. The reasons are lost to time, but the consequence was catastrophic for the future of the principality. In a stunning decision that defied both custom and political prudence, Prince Yaroslav formally disinherited Vladimirko, casting aside the son born of his lawful marriage. In his place, he designated a different heir, Oleg, his beloved son by his mistress, a woman named Anastasia. This was not merely a father playing favorites. It was a sovereign making a decision that threatened to overturn the established social and political order. By elevating his illegitimate son over his legitimate one, Yaroslav was challenging the very foundations of dynastic legitimacy. The powerful boyar aristocracy, the great landowners of Halych, were deeply conservative. They saw the prince's actions as a dangerous and tyrannical caprice, an insult to tradition that could set a precedent for arbitrary rule. The situation grew so volatile that the boyars eventually rose up in revolt, forcing Yaroslav to briefly flee his own capital. They compelled him to swear an oath to take back his lawful wife, whom he had cast aside for his mistress, and to recognize Vladimirko as his heir once more. For a time, it seemed the crisis had been averted, but the underlying passions had not been extinguished, they had only been suppressed. The prince's true intentions remained an open secret, and the court was divided into factions supporting the two rival sons. The entire principality was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the aging ruler's authority would no longer be there to contain the explosion. That moment arrived in 1187. With Yaroslav's death, the dam broke. The complex web of promises and forced reconciliations evaporated. The faction supporting Oleg, the illegitimate son, immediately moved to secure power for their candidate, likely believing they were carrying out the true will of their late prince. But the boyars who supported the legitimate Vladimirko would not accept this. What followed was not a simple dispute, but a brutal and protracted civil war that raged within the walls of Halych itself. The conflict was as much a class struggle as a succession battle. It was the aristocracy reasserting its power against a prince who had tried to override their cherished customs. Vladimirko, freed from prison, became the banner for this conservative reaction. The fighting was savage, with control of the princely throne changing hands multiple times in a bloody tug of war. Oleg's mother, Anastasia, was hunted down and burned at the stake by the victorious boyars at one point, a horrifying act that reveals the depth of the hatred unleashed by Yaroslav's fateful decision. This internal self-destruction did not go unnoticed beyond the borders of Halych. For the ambitious monarchs of Hungary and Poland, the chaos next door was not a tragedy but an invitation. A strong, unified Halych was a valuable ally or a formidable obstacle. A Halych tearing itself apart was a ripe fruit ready to be plucked. King Bela III of Hungary was the first to intervene, marching into the principality under the pretext of supporting one of the claimants, but with the clear intention of annexing the territory outright. He installed his own son, Andrew, as prince, a move that effectively placed Halych under Hungarian occupation. This, in turn, provoked the Kingdom of Poland, which had its own historical claims and strategic interests in the region. The Polish Duke Casimir II felt compelled to counter the Hungarian advance, leading his own army into the fray. What had begun as a domestic quarrel was now an international crisis. For the next several decades, Halych became a pawn in a grander game, its throne a prize to be fought over by Hungarian and Polish armies, with the native princes and boyars often reduced to playing the two powerful neighbors against each other in a desperate bid to salvage some shred of autonomy. The death of Yaroslav Osmomysl, therefore, demonstrates a profound historical truth with devastating clarity. A ruler's personal life, their private loves and hatreds, could never be entirely separated from the fate of the state they governed. A decision made in the heat of family passion, especially one concerning the all-important question of succession, could unleash forces far beyond the palace walls. Yaroslav's attempt to privilege his affection for his mistress and their son over the cold logic of dynastic tradition destabilized not just his own court, but an entire region. It turned a prosperous and independent principality into a battleground for foreign empires, proving that the most dangerous threats to a kingdom's sovereignty could sometimes germinate not in the council chamber or on the battlefield, but in the intimate and often tragic drama of a ruler's own household. Sometimes the most profound shifts in power are not sudden explosions, but slow burning fuses lit by a single event, a chain reaction whose final, earth-shaking conclusion only becomes clear years or even decades later. The death of Count Baldwin IV of Hainaut in 1171 is a masterclass in this kind of delayed action history. On the surface, his passing seemed to produce a straightforward and orderly transition. His son, a man already seasoned in the arts of governance, smoothly inherited the county as Baldwin V. There was no civil war, no foreign invasion, no immediate scramble for the spoils. For the people of Hainaut, it was a moment of stability, a simple changing of the guard. But beneath this calm surface, Baldwin IV's death was the first, crucial domino to fall in a sequence that would, within a single generation, radically alter the balance of power in the entire region of the Low Countries. The true significance of this quiet succession lay not in the territory Baldwin V inherited from his father, but in the even greater prize he would acquire through the destiny that had been carefully arranged for him years earlier, a strategic marriage. That destiny was named Margaret. She was the younger sister of the Count of Flanders, Philip of Alsace, and she was one of the most eligible heiresses in all of Western Europe. The County of Flanders was a titan among the principalities of the region. Its cities, like Bruges and Ghent, were the pulsating heart of the medieval cloth trade, generating wealth that dwarfed the revenues of many kings. Its counts were powerful, ambitious, and often in direct competition with the growing power of the French crown. The marriage between Baldwin V of Hainaut and Margaret of Flanders was not a love match. It was a calculated political alliance, a classic tool of medieval statecraft designed to bind two neighboring houses together. At the time of Count Baldwin IV's death, this marriage was a promise of future influence, a potential avenue for closer cooperation, but it had not yet yielded its ultimate geopolitical payoff. The Count of Flanders, Philip, was a vigorous ruler, and the expectation was that he would produce his own male heir, ensuring that Flanders would remain under the direct control of the House of Alsace. This is where the delayed reaction comes into play. For a decade, the status quo held. Baldwin V governed Hainaut, and Count Philip ruled Flanders. But then, in 1180, the political landscape was upended. Count Philip of Alsace died while on crusade in the Holy Land, and critically, he died without a surviving male heir. His wife had borne him only daughters who had predeceased him. This sudden, childless death created a vacuum of the most dramatic kind. The immense wealth and power of Flanders now had no clear male heir from the direct line. According to the complex customs of inheritance, the claim passed laterally to his closest female relative, his sister Margaret, and through Margaret, the claim passed directly to her husband, Baldwin V of Hainaut. The man who had once been the count of a respectable but secondary territory suddenly found himself the ruler of two of the most significant principalities in the Low Countries. The counties of Hainaut and Flanders were now united in a personal union, creating a contiguous block of territory that stretched from the forests of the Ardennes to the North Sea coast. The creation of this dual county was a geopolitical earthquake. Baldwin, now often called Baldwin VIII of Flanders, commanded resources that were truly royal in scale. The agricultural lands of Hainaut provided food and men, while the commercial powerhouse of Flanders provided unparalleled financial muscle. Overnight, the Count of Flanders Hainaut became one of the most formidable princes in all of Europe, a neighbor who could now deal with the kings of France and England on a nearly equal footing. This new power block fundamentally altered the dynamics of the region. It limited the ability of the French king to play the Counts of Flanders and Hainaut against each other, a classic divide-and-rule tactic. Instead, he now faced a consolidated rival on his northern border, a single entity with the means to challenge royal authority and pursue an independent foreign policy. The union also had profound internal consequences, as the Count now had to balance the interests of the proud, independent-minded Flemish burghers with those of his more traditional feudal nobility in Hainaut. The death of Count Baldwin IV in 1171 was the essential precondition for this entire transformation. If he had lived another 20 years, the succession in Flanders would have unfolded differently. Perhaps another relative would have pressed a claim, or the French king would have intervened more decisively. But by dying when he did, he allowed his son, Baldwin V, to be perfectly positioned to seize the moment a decade later. He had raised a competent successor, secured a brilliant marriage alliance, and then stepped aside at the right historical moment for that plan to reach its full, world-altering potential. This story reminds us that medieval power was not just about the battles fought or the laws passed during a lifetime. It was also about the seeds a ruler planted, the marriages they arranged, the children they educated, the alliances they forged, whose true harvest would only be reaped long after they were gone. The most lasting legacy of a leader can sometimes be the invisible architecture they build for a future they will never see. The political landscape of Poland in the 12th century presents a fascinating and ultimately tragic case study of a kingdom that chose a path of self-imposed division. Unlike many of its European neighbors, which were slowly, if painfully, moving toward greater centralization under a single monarch, Poland had embraced a system that guaranteed fragmentation. This was the era of the Rewrote principle, a unique solution to the problem of royal succession that was less a law and more a recipe for perpetual conflict. Following the death of a powerful ruler who had briefly reunited the Polish lands, his will carved the kingdom into several distinct duchies, each granted to one of his sons. But there was a twist. The eldest surviving member of the entire Pius dynasty would hold the title of High Duke and rule the senior province, which included the historic capital of Krakow. This prince, the princeps, was meant to be a first among equals, a senior brother who would coordinate foreign policy and provide a semblance of unity. In theory, it was a clever way to honor family bonds while providing for all the male heirs. In practice, it created a political pressure cooker where ambition and resentment simmered just below the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. Into this volatile system stepped Boleslaw IV, known to history as the Curly. For nearly 3 decades, he managed to wear the fragile crown of the High Duke, navigating the treacherous currents of Pius family politics with a combination of diplomacy and force. His reign was not a period of great expansion or glory, but rather one of careful maintenance. He spent much of his energy fending off challenges from his younger brothers, particularly the ambitious Mieszko III and the formidable Casimir II, who felt their own claims were just as valid. Boleslaw's authority was constantly tested, his position as senior prince less a position of command and more a constant negotiation. He was the man trying to hold a cracked vase together, applying pressure at every fissure to prevent it from shattering completely. His long tenure provided a certain stability, but it was a stability built on the temporary containment of powerful rivalries, not their resolution. The entire delicate structure depended entirely on his personal ability to manage his restless kin. When Boleslaw IV died in 1173, the containing pressure was instantly released. The transition, on paper, should have been smooth. The Rewrote principle dictated that the title of High Duke and the control of Krakow should pass to the next oldest brother, which was Mieszko III, aptly nicknamed the Old. And initially, this is exactly what happened. Mieszko assumed the senior position, but he quickly discovered that possessing the title was not the same as wielding the authority that came with it. The problem was one of personality and ambition. Where Boleslaw had been a pragmatist, Mieszko was an authoritarian. He attempted to rule his brothers and their duchies with a heavy hand, demanding obedience and resources in a way that his late brother never had. This aggressive assertion of power was a direct challenge to the growing sense of autonomy that the junior dukes had enjoyed. They were no longer willing to accept the old idea of seniority if it meant subservience to a domineering brother. This resistance found its most powerful voice in Casimir II, the youngest of the brothers, who had been too young to receive a duchy in the original partition and was known as the Just. Casimir became the leader of a powerful coalition of lesser princes and magnates who were deeply dissatisfied with Mieszko's rigid interpretation of the seigneuriate system. They argued that the principle was outdated and unfair, and they championed a different idea, the right of direct lineal descent, where a father's duchy would pass intact to his own sons. This was not just a theoretical debate, it was a struggle for the very soul of the Polish state. Would it remain a loose confederation of rival duchies under a nominal seigneur, or would it begin a slow journey back toward unification under a single, stronger line? The death of Boleslaw the Curly, therefore, did not simply trigger another routine reshuffling of power. It acted as a catalyst, exposing a fundamental flaw that had been festering for generations. The conflict that erupted was no longer just about which individual prince would sit in Krakow. It was a war over the rules of the game itself. The seigneuriate principle, designed to prevent war, now became its primary cause. For the next century, the history of Poland would be a dismal cycle of civil wars, brief periods of shaky reunification, and further fragmentation. Brothers fought against brothers, uncles against nephews, in a seemingly endless loop of familial strife that sapped the kingdom's strength and left it vulnerable to its external enemies. The powerful German princes to the west and the Mongol hordes to the east would soon take advantage of this internal weakness. The passing of the High Duke in 1173 was the moment the crack in the vase became a rupture, a sudden power shift that plunged Poland into a long twilight of division, proving that a political system built on a contradiction cannot withstand the test of time. The world of the early 13th century was one of increasingly hardened borders and nascent national identities, particularly in the volatile space between the kingdoms of England and Scotland. For generations, the great baronial families of the borderlands had navigated a complex existence, holding lands in both realms and swearing fealty to two different kings. They were the essential grease in the machinery of Anglo-Scottish relations, men who could temper conflict with their cross-border influence and personal connections. Perhaps no figure embodied this delicate balancing act more perfectly than David of Huntingdon. He was not a king, but his position was uniquely powerful. As the younger brother of two successive kings of Scots, William the Lion and then Alexander II, David was a prince of the Scottish royal blood. Yet, through inheritance and marriage, he was also one of the most significant barons in England, holding the vast and lucrative earldom of Huntingdon. His life was a testament to the possibility of a unified cross-channel aristocracy, a man who moved seamlessly between the court of his brother in Edinburgh and the court of his feudal lord, the King of England. For decades, he served as a crucial intermediary, a trusted voice who could negotiate treaties, soothe tensions, and remind both monarchs of the benefits of peace. His very existence was a living bridge between the two kingdoms. When Earl David died in 1219, his passing was marked with the respect due a statesman of his stature. But beneath the surface of this peaceful transition lay a ticking time bomb, one created by the most personal of tragedies. He died without a male heir. In the rigidly patrilineal world of medieval inheritance, this was a catastrophe for the continuity of his house, but it was a geopolitical opportunity of the highest order. His immense estates, a sprawling portfolio of manors, castles, and rights that stretched across the English Midlands and into Scotland, did not simply vanish. Instead, they passed to his three daughters, Margaret, Isabel, and Ada. These women became, overnight, some of the wealthiest heiresses in Britain. Yet, in this society, a woman's inheritance was not something she controlled in her own right for long. It was a prize that was transferred to the authority of her husband upon marriage. And the men these sisters had married were not minor Scottish lairds. They were among the most powerful and ambitious barons in the Kingdom of England. Margaret had married Alan, Lord of Galloway, a magnate with immense power in southwestern Scotland, but it was the husbands of the other two sisters whose identities would have the most profound consequences. Isabel was the wife of Robert de Bruce, the Lord of Annandale, a baron with strong ties to both kingdoms but whose primary power base was in England. Most significantly, Ada was married to Henry de Hastings, a firmly English nobleman with deep roots in the English Midlands. This meant that the great Huntingdon inheritance, which had been held by a man whose primary loyalty was to his brother the King of Scots, was now splintered into three parts, each falling under the control of English-oriented barons. The Bruce and Hastings families, in particular, now found themselves endowed with massive landholdings inside England. Their wealth, status, and political influence were now inextricably linked to the English crown. They sat in the English Parliament, they provided knights for the English king's armies, and their economic interests were deeply embedded in the English countryside. This created an immediate and deeply problematic conflict of interest. Both Robert de Bruce and Henry de Hastings were now, by marriage, major Scottish nobles, yet their primary sources of power and their feudal obligations lay in England. Their children, the grandchildren of Earl David, would inherit these divided loyalties. The clear line that had once existed, however faintly, between the Scottish and English aristocracies was now hopelessly blurred. A baron like Robert de Bruce might be called upon to raise his banner for the King of England one day, and then be expected to counsel the King of Scotland the next. When tensions flared between the two crowns, these men would be torn in two. Do they follow their feudal oath to the English king, to whom they owed their primary allegiance for their English lands, or do they support their Scottish royal cousins, the family of their mother or grandmother? This was no longer an abstract question of diplomacy. It was a wrenching personal and political dilemma that would be passed down through generations. The full, devastating impact of this inherited conflict would not become apparent for another 60 years, but when it did, it would help to fuel one of the most defining conflicts in British history, the Wars of Scottish Independence. The seeds sown by Earl David's childless death germinated during the crisis that followed the death of the young Margaret, Maid of Norway, in 1290. When the Scottish throne was left vacant, the two leading claimants were John Balliol and none other than Robert de Bruce, the grandson of David of Huntingdon's daughter Isabel. This was not just a dynastic dispute, it was a civil war within the Anglo-Scottish aristocracy itself. The Bruce family's claim to the Scottish crown was directly derived from their connection to the Scottish royal house through Earl David. Yet their power and their ability to press that claim were dependent on the vast English estates they had inherited through that very same connection. The Bruces were simultaneously premier Scottish nobles and major English barons, a contradiction that became unbearable when King Edward I of England asserted his overlordship over Scotland. The story of the Earl of Huntingdon's death, therefore, is a powerful lesson in the law of unintended consequences. A quiet succession in 1219 did not cause a war, but it fundamentally altered the composition of the noble class that would be forced to fight it. It created a coterie of powerful lords with fatally split personalities, men whose blood and land pulled them in opposite directions. This internal division within the nobility made it harder for Scotland to present a united front against English aggression and added a layer of bitter familial rivalry to the national struggle. The conflict between Bruce and Balliol was in part a dispute between two branches of the same cross-border elite that David of Huntingdon had represented. His demise did not just transfer property, it created a fault line that ran through the very heart of the ruling class, a crack that would widen under pressure until the whole structure of British politics shattered into decades of war. It demonstrates that sometimes the most significant power shifts are not those that change the map overnight, but those that subtly rewire the loyalties of the powerful, planting the dormant seeds of future conflict that will only bloom under the heat of a later crisis. The sudden passing of King Erik X of Sweden in the year 1216 is a classic example of a reign cut short just as it was beginning to plant deep roots, a tragedy that left a kingdom teetering on the brink of instability. Erik's time on the throne had been brief, but it was marked by significant and controversial actions that had begun to reshape the Swedish monarchy. Most notably, he was the first Swedish king to be crowned in a formal church ceremony, a move intended to sanctify his authority and tie the crown more closely to the growing power of the Catholic Church. He also championed the Church's interests, supporting the establishment of a national legal code and aligning himself with the papal cause in its ongoing struggle with the Holy Roman Empire. These steps were all part of a larger project to centralize royal power, to transform the king from merely the strongest among a group of quarrelful nobles into a sovereign whose authority was divinely sanctioned and institutionally unassailable. But such ambitious reforms inevitably create powerful enemies. The traditional Swedish aristocracy, a class of magnates known as the folkungar, were deeply wary of a king who sought to diminish their ancient privileges and autonomy. Erik's attempts to build a stronger monarchy threatened their traditional right to elect kings and influence policy, setting the stage for a confrontation that his death would instantly trigger. The crisis was immediate and profound. King Erik left behind an heir, but that heir was a mere infant, a boy who would be christened Erik XI. In the rough and tumble world of 13th century politics, a child king was the worst possible guarantee of stability. It meant a long and vulnerable regency, a period where competing factions of nobles would battle for control of the child, and by extension, the kingdom. This was a prospect that filled the powerful Swedish aristocracy with dread. They had seen the chaos that could ensue from a weak regency, and they feared that a prolonged period of minority rule would undo the fragile unity of the realm and leave Sweden exposed to its external rivals. The folkungar made a decisive and ruthless choice. They simply bypassed the infant heir entirely. Setting aside the principle of direct hereditary succession, the Council of Nobles elected a rival claimant, John I, from a different branch of the royal family to be the new king. This was not a peaceful succession. It was a political usurpation, a clear statement that the will of the aristocracy would trump the claims of an infant, no matter how legitimate his bloodline. This act of election fundamentally weakened the Swedish crown at a critical moment. The new king, John I, owed his position not to divine right or primogeniture, but to the nobles who had placed him on the throne. His authority was therefore conditional from the very start. To secure their support, he would have been forced to make concessions, to promise not to pursue the same centralizing policies that had made Erik X so controversial. The momentum toward a stronger, more independent monarchy was abruptly halted. The power of the aristocracy was reasserted with a vengeance, ensuring that Sweden would remain, for the foreseeable future, a kingdom where the king was little more than the most powerful noble, forced to rule in consultation with his peers and unable to act without their consent. This internal conflict and the resulting weakness at the center of government made Sweden a less coherent actor on the Scandinavian stage, just as its neighbors Denmark and Norway were consolidating their own royal powers. But the consequences of Erik's death rippled far beyond Sweden's borders, thanks to a poignant and politically charged flight. Erik's widow, Queen Richilde, was a Danish princess, the daughter of King Valdemar I of Denmark. With her husband dead and her infant son disinherited by the Swedish nobles, her position in Sweden became untenable and dangerous. she was a symbol of the rejected line, and her son's very existence was a permanent threat to the new regime. To protect her child and herself, she did what many exiled royals have done throughout history. She fled home. Taking the infant Erik with her, she sought refuge at the Danish court, which was now ruled by her relatives. This was not just a personal retreat, it was a political act of immense significance. By sheltering the rightful heir to the Swedish throne, the Danish kings acquired a powerful weapon. The young Erik, often called Erik the Lisp and Lame, became a living claim, a pretender whose cause could be invoked whenever it suited Danish interests. For the next several decades, the boy growing up in exile in Denmark was a constant shadow over Swedish politics. The Danish crown could, and did, use his claim to interfere in Swedish affairs, to destabilize kings they disliked, and to press for territorial or political concessions. The dispute over the Swedish succession, ignited by the aristocracy's decision in 1216, became a permanent feature of Scandinavian diplomacy. It injected a bitter dynastic rivalry into the already tense relations between Denmark and Sweden, ensuring that conflicts between them would not just be about borders or trade, but about the very legitimacy of the ruling house in Stockholm. The early death of King Erik X, therefore, did not merely cause a brief period of internal trouble. It interrupted a crucial phase in the development of the Swedish state, empowered the nobility at the expense of the crown, and gifted Sweden's primary rival a potent diplomatic tool that would be leveraged for generations, weaving a thread of Danish ambition into the very fabric of Swedish history. The struggle for the soul of Occitania, that vibrant and independent region of southern France, found its most enduring symbol in the beleaguered figure of Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. For over 2 decades, he had been the primary target and the chief defender in the Albigensian Crusade, a conflict that was as much a brutal war of northern French conquest as it was a religious campaign against the Cathar heresy. Raymond's reign was a masterclass in survival under impossible pressure, a constant dance of defiance, temporary submission, and desperate negotiation against the relentless advance of Crusader armies led by figures like Simon de Montfort. He was a master of the ambiguous gesture, often yielding just enough to the church and the northern barons to avoid total annihilation, only to reclaim his authority the moment their attention wavered. His resistance was not that of a heroic champion leading a unified army to victory, but that of a cunning fox, using the landscape of diplomacy and local loyalty to protect his ancestral domains from being swallowed whole. This style of protracted, flexible defense had kept the dream of Occitan autonomy alive long after many thought it should have been extinguished. When Raymond VI finally passed away in 1222, exhausted by a lifetime of war and political intrigue, the nature of the conflict shifted fundamentally. The struggle was not over. It was inherited by his son, Raymond VII, a younger man who had grown up in the shadow of the crusade and was determined to continue the fight. But the father's death marked the end of an era defined by a particular kind of cunning resilience. The old count's deep knowledge of the complex web of southern loyalties, his personal relationships with other local lords, and his skill at playing the papal legates against the French crown died with him. Raymond VII brought energy and a renewed martial spirit to the cause, but he lacked the nuanced, almost instinctual understanding of the political game that had allowed his father to survive for so long. The conflict was now stripped of its older, more subtle layers, becoming a more direct and conventional military confrontation between a determined southern prince and the consolidated power of the French monarchy. This new, stark reality became painfully clear in the years following the succession. Despite early successes in rallying the southern lords and even recapturing the city of Toulouse, Raymond VII found himself facing a more formidable and single-minded opponent than his father ever had. The French king, Louis VIII, personally took up the crusade, bringing the full weight of the royal army to bear in a way that previous crusader leaders could not. The death of Raymond VI had, in a sense, removed the last excuse for the French crown to hold back. The new count was a clear and present rebel, and the king was now determined to settle the matter decisively. Although Louis VIII died during the campaign in 1226, his death did not bring relief. Instead, it ushered in the regency of his formidable widow, Blanche of Castile, ruling for the boy King Louis IX. Blanche proved to be an even more relentless and capable adversary, skillfully managing the kingdom's resources to grind down the southern resistance through a war of attrition that the depleted county of Toulouse could not hope to win. The inevitable culmination came in 1229 with the Treaty of Paris, also known as the Treaty of Meaux. Forced to the negotiating table by military exhaustion and the sheer weight of his opponent's resources, Raymond VII had to accept terms that were as humiliating as they were transformative. He was allowed to keep the core of his domains for his lifetime, but the treaty spelled the certain end of his dynasty's independent rule. The most crushing clause concerned his daughter and only heir, Jean. The treaty stipulated that she would be married to one of the brothers of King Louis IX, Alphonse of Poitiers. Furthermore, it was decreed that if Raymond and his new wife did not produce a male heir, a prospect the French crown likely did little to encourage, the entire county of Toulouse would pass directly to Jean and her husband upon Raymond's death. This was not just a marriage alliance, it was a meticulously planned annexation, a legal trap designed to absorb Toulouse into the royal domain without the need for further conquest. The passing of Raymond VI, therefore, was the hinge upon which the fate of southern France turned. It was the moment when a long, gritty struggle for survival transitioned into a managed and inevitable incorporation. His death did not cause the immediate fall of Toulouse, but it removed the last leader whose entire political being was rooted in the old, independent order of Occitania. His son fought bravely, but he was fighting a new kind of war against an enemy that had resolved to end the question of southern autonomy for good. The Treaty of Paris was the direct consequence of this shift, a document that ratified the victory of the North not on the battlefield alone, but in the cold, calculating chambers of royal law. Raymond VI's lifetime of resistance had delayed the inevitable, but his demise set the clock ticking on a future where his beloved lands would no longer be ruled by their own counts, but by a prince of the French royal house, signaling the final sunset on the unique world of the Occitan civilization. The story of King Valdemar II of Denmark, known to history as Valdemar the Victorious, is one of remarkable success and expansion. His reign marked a high point for the Danish kingdom, a period where its influence stretched across the Baltic Sea, its laws were codified, and its monarchy seemed stronger than ever. He was a ruler who had seemingly mastered the art of dynasty building, securing his legacy with a clear and publicly acknowledged plan for the future. That plan had a name, Valdemar the Young. The king was astute enough to recognize that a smooth transition of power was the greatest gift he could give his kingdom, a safeguard against the civil wars that had plagued Denmark's past. To this end, he had his eldest son, Valdemar the Young, crowned as co-king and designated heir while the father was still very much alive and in command. This was not an empty title. The young Valdemar was given his own court, responsibilities, and a share of royal authority. He was being groomed in the full view of the nation, a prince learning the craft of kingship under the direct guidance of a master. For years, this system worked beautifully. The father and son team ruled together, presenting a united front that promised decades of continued stability, and the peaceful continuation of the Valdemarian Golden Age. The future of Denmark looked not just secure but brilliantly illuminated. Then, in the year 1231, in the prime of his life, that brilliant future was extinguished in a moment of tragic misadventure. King Valdemar the Young was participating in a hunt, a common and celebrated royal pastime, when a terrible accident occurred. The specifics are lost to time, but the outcome was horrifyingly clear. The young co-king was dead. This was not a death on a battlefield, a fate a medieval prince was prepared to accept. It was a senseless, random accident, a twist of fate that carried with it a uniquely devastating psychological blow. The kingdom was not just losing an heir, it was confronting the cruel fragility of even the most carefully laid plans. The grief of the old king, Valdemar the Victorious, must have been immeasurable, compounded by the terrifying political abyss that now opened before him. The designated successor, the man upon whom the entire architecture of the future had been built, was gone. The king was now advanced in years, and the question of what would happen after his own death, which had once been so comfortably settled, was now a source of panic and dread. The immediate crisis was one of a missing generation. Valdemar the Young had been the bridge. He was old enough to be experienced and respected, yet young enough to promise a long and stable reign. With him gone, the succession fell to his younger brothers, but these boys were just that, boys, too young to have been prepared for the burden of kingship in the way their elder brother had been. The most prominent among them was a child named Eric. The old king, in his grief and desperation, did what he could. He had this young Eric elevated to the status of co-heir, attempting to rebuild the shattered succession plan. But the damage was done. The magic of the original arrangement was lost. The first co-kingship had been a confident act of statecraft. The second was a frantic patch job, a transparent attempt to plug a hole in a sinking ship. The Danish nobility, who had sworn allegiance to the mature and capable Valdemar the Young, looked upon the child Eric with uncertainty. The clear line of succession had become blurred, and in that blur, ambition began to stir. When Valdemar the Victorious finally died in 1241, the precariousness of the situation was revealed in all its destructive glory. The kingdom did not unite behind the young King Eric, who became Eric IV. Instead, it fractured. His younger brothers, Abel and Christopher, were now grown men with their own power bases and their own fierce ambitions. They looked at their brother on the throne and saw not their king, but an obstacle. The carefully constructed unity of their father's reign shattered into pieces as the brothers turned on each other in a brutal struggle for power. This was not a simple family quarrel. It was a civil war that ripped Denmark apart. The period that followed is one of the darkest in Danish history. King Eric IV would meet a gruesome end, murdered and thrown into a fjord, with his brother Abel widely suspected of being the architect of the regicide. Abel's own reign was short, and he was succeeded by Christopher, under whose rule the internal conflicts continued to simmer. This fratricidal strife had catastrophic consequences for the kingdom Valdemar the Victorious had built. The strong, centralized monarchy that had projected power across the Baltic Sea was no more. The royal treasury was drained by constant warfare, and the king's authority was hollowed out as he was forced to grant massive concessions to the nobility to buy their fleeting support. The expansive foreign policy died, and Danish territories in northern Germany and Estonia were lost as the kingdom, consumed with fighting itself, could no longer defend its empire. The accidental death of a young man on a hunt decades earlier had set in motion a chain reaction that dismantled a golden age. It serves as a stark, heartbreaking lesson in the limits of human planning. A ruler could win every battle, draft every law, and secure every border, but he could not control fate. The stability of an entire nation, it turned out, could be as fragile as a single life, and the hopes for a peaceful future could be undone by something as random and unpredictable as a single stray arrow on a sunny afternoon. Having journeyed through these 25 dramatic stories, a tapestry of shared truths begins to emerge from the chaos, revealing the fundamental mechanics of power in the medieval world. The most glaring pattern, the thread that connects stories from Croatia to Catalonia, is the terrifying fragility of a bloodline. Time and again, we witnessed how the absence of a clear, adult male heir acted like a key turning in a lock, instantly transforming a stable domain into a coveted prize. This was not merely a matter of a missing ruler, it was the collapse of an entire political system built on personal loyalty. A county or a kingdom was not an abstract institution with a life of its own, but an extension of a single individual's authority. When that individual died without a son old enough to wield a sword and command respect, the intricate web of oaths sworn directly to him simply dissolved. The land became ownerless in a political sense, a vacuum that nature, and more importantly, ambitious neighbors, were compelled to fill. This single vulnerability was the recurring catalyst for invasion, civil war, and the dramatic redrawing of maps. This leads us to the second profound pattern, the intensely personal nature of medieval rule. Alliances were not between nations but between men. A treaty sworn by a count was only as durable as the count himself. The death of a leader like Magnus Barefoot of Norway did not just mean a new king. It meant the instantaneous cancellation of his entire foreign policy, the recall of his fleets, and the abandonment of his imperial ambitions. The personal bond was the glue of the political world. A vassal's loyalty was to his lord, not to the office or the land. This is why the sudden death of a figure like Earl Harald Maddadson in Orkney was so destabilizing. He alone held the balance between Norway and Scotland through the force of his personality and his unique heritage. Once he was gone, that delicate equilibrium vanished with him because it existed in his person, not in any treaty document. The state was the ruler, and the ruler was the state, making his lifespan the most critical variable in the equation of stability. Yet within this male-dominated system, we also uncovered the pivotal, often paradoxical, role of women. While typically excluded from direct rule, women were absolutely central to the transmission of power as heiresses. The death of a childless lord could transform his daughter into the most valuable political asset on the continent. Her marriage was not a romantic affair but a decisive geopolitical act. The union of Baldwin V of Hainaut and Margaret of Flanders, triggered by a series of childless deaths, created a powerful new principality overnight. Conversely, the flight of the widowed Queen Richilde of Sweden back to Denmark with her infant son gave the Danish crown a permanent claim to the Swedish throne for generations. Women like Countess Richilde of Hainaut show us they could also be active defenders of their domains, their deaths leaving a territory exposed to its enemies. As daughters, wives, and mothers, women were the conduits through which power flowed, the living vessels of inheritance whose fate could spell the difference between a dynasty's triumph or its extinction. Stepping back from kings and counts, these stories collectively reveal that medieval politics was ultimately a high-stakes game of chance. The course of history could be altered as decisively by a random fever in a besieged camp as by the outcome of a grand battle. A hunting accident could undo decades of careful dynastic planning, as it did for the Danes with Valdemar the Young. A single shipwreck could plunge a kingdom into 20 years of anarchy, as happened with the White Ship. An assassin's dagger in a Bohemian forest could nullify a duke's ambitious reforms and plunge his duchy back into civil war. This element of sheer contingency forces us to reevaluate how history unfolds. We are often drawn to the grand narratives of economic forces, cultural shifts, and the deliberate strategies of great leaders, but these 25 shifts remind us that underlying all of those slower currents is the unpredictable rhythm of human mortality. History is not just shaped in the roar of the battlefield, but in the quiet, often unnoticed moments of transition, a final breath in a silent chamber, a missed step on a wet rock, a sudden illness on a foreign campaign. It is in these silent exits that the seeds of empires were often sown, and the fates of nations were quietly sealed. The deaths of these 25 lesser-known leaders were not mere footnotes. They were hinges upon which history turned, quiet moments of departure that echoed with the force of a slammed door. Their stories teach us a fundamental and often unsettling truth about the Middle Ages. Power was not an abstract force contained within institutions, but something profoundly personal and terrifyingly fragile, tethered to the heartbeat of a single individual. We have seen how a stable realm, built over decades of careful rule, could descend into chaos overnight because a count caught a fever on a foreign campaign. We have witnessed a minor county, a speck on the map, suddenly become the focal point of an empire's ambition, all because a duke died without a son to carry his name. This was a world where the future of nations could be decided not in a grand council chamber, but in the lonely confines of a sick room or on the treacherous footing of a forest path. By looking beyond the famous kings and emperors who dominate our textbooks, we uncover a deeper, more intricate tapestry of cause and effect. The great sweep of history, so often told as the story of famous battles and coronations, is also woven from these countless quiet threads. Each of these rulers, no matter how seemingly insignificant from our distant vantage point, held a strand in the fabric of their time. The ambitions of a Philip of Flanders, the desperate diplomacy of a Raymond of Toulouse, the tragic illness of an Ottokar of Styria, these were not side stories. They were central to the lived experience of millions, determining the laws they lived under, the taxes they paid, and the armies that might march across their fields. When we focus only on the famous names, we miss the complex machinery of history, the interconnected gears and pulleys that truly drove change. These lesser-known figures were often the crucial pivots, the points where pressure built and the direction of events was suddenly, violently altered. This perspective invites us to reconsider how we assign significance in history. We tend to memorialize the winners, the founders of dynasties, the architects of lasting institutions. But what about the men and women whose exits created the conditions for those victories? What about the power vacuums that allowed new dynasties to rise, or the inheritance disputes that forced the creation of new laws? The story of Valdemar the Young of Denmark is a heartbreaking lesson in how the most meticulous plans for the future can be undone by a single, random accident, plunging a golden age into a fratricidal nightmare. The tale of Yaroslav Osmomysl of Halych shows us how a ruler's private family drama could unleash a civil war that invited foreign invasion and erased a principality's independence. Significance is not always measured in years of stable rule. Sometimes it is measured in the scale of the disruption that follows a sudden departure. Ultimately, these 25 stories collectively argue for a more nuanced, more human understanding of the past. They remind us that history is not a predetermined march toward a known destination, but a web of countless possibilities, any one of which could have been amplified by a different outcome on a single day. The Middle Ages were not a simple time of knights and castles. They were an era of breathtaking complexity and constant, unpredictable change, where the line between order and chaos was perilously thin. The next time you read about a famous king's coronation or a decisive treaty, it is worth asking, what quiet exit, what overlooked death, created the opening that made that moment possible? The past is full of these hidden doors, and by learning to spot them, we gain a much richer appreciation for the true, messy, and fascinating story of how our world came to be. If this journey into history's overlooked corners has intrigued you, we would love to hear which of these sudden power shifts surprised or fascinated you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you are eager for more explorations of the pivotal moments that flew beneath the radar, be sure to subscribe to the channel for our next